So what we're doing in these dialogues is we're asking three big questions. The first is, what do all civilizations have in common? How do you know a civilization when you see one? And more importantly, does every civilization operate according to a predetermined or somewhat predetermined life cycle? If so, what can we say about this cycle? And how much room is there in it for human agency? So that's our first question, kind of what do all civilizations have in common? What are the patterns that are common to all civilizations? Our second question is, how do civilizations differ from each other across space? For example, how is Western civilization different from Chinese civilization? And our third question is, how have civilizations changed over time? For example, does our consciousness structure mutate over time, as Gebser posits? How does that relate to Campbell's chronology from animal powers to seeded earth to celestial lights to man? How does it relate to Toynbee's multiple generations of civilization? In what ways, if any, does civilization progress over time? In what ways does it not progress? Okay, so three big questions. What do all civilizations have in common? How do civilizations differ from each other across space? And how civilizations changed over time. Now, our first conversation was an introduction to these questions with reference to numerous thinkers who have influenced you, such as Spengler, Toynbee, Gebser, Campbell, McLuhan, Thompson, and others. And what we're going to be doing from this point forward is drilling down on specific issues related to these three big questions. So what are we doing in this, our second round? Well, what we're doing is making sure that when we ask these three questions about civilization, we are defining our basic term, our unit of analysis, civilization, transparently. So these conversations you and I are having, they depart from the premise that there is such a thing as civilization, and there is such a thing as a civilization, a discrete entity. There are multiple civilizations in the world right now. There have been other civilizations in the past. There have also been many societies, and there are many societies that are not civilizations. So in this conversation, we really have two questions. First, what makes a civilization different from a society that is not civilized, different from a pre-civilized society, we might say? I would call these the vertical criteria of civilization. And then second, what makes one civilization different from another? How do you know when you've stopped looking at one civilization and started looking at another one? These would be the horizontal criteria of civilization. And furthermore, as we discussed in our first conversation, we can ask both of these questions from an interior and an exterior perspective.
This is an important question. What is a civilization? And what are Toynbee and Spengler talking about when they use those words? Of course, we've already made a distinction with Spengler between the culture phase and the civilization phase, but that's just a special category that he makes divisive in his system. But we're talking about high civilization, which called high civilization, which comes in during the Bronze Age. So it's connected with technology. On the one hand, you've got bronze working that comes in, that starts to come in about 4000 BC-ish, somewhere around there. People start figuring out how to work bronze, and this has shifted. Sometimes this late Neolithic period is called the Chalcolithic, where copper working comes in with the Chalcolithic about 1,000 years earlier, 5,000, maybe 6,000. And so there's gradually been these layers of technology that have accreted. So this is one way of looking at it. If we go back to the Paleolithic and we say, in the Upper Paleolithic, which goes back to, let's say, 50,000 years ago, something like that, the Upper Paleolithic, which means it's archaeologically closer to the surface and therefore more recent. The Lower Paleolithic is beneath it. It goes back to about 2 million years ago. And then, well, let's take a look. 2 million years ago, what's going on? We've got Homo habilis, who has now differentiated himself or themselves from Australopithecines in the sense that now they can make tools. So they're sitting here, they're taking obsidian and flint, but mostly obsidian, and they're hacking away at it just to make a tool. So they've discovered that they have an appetite for meat now, and the Australopithecines don't. They remain vegetarian. Not a surprise that they died out. Meat eaters, I believe that meat makes you smart. The protein in meat builds up the brain, and the smartest animals are carnivores without exception, whether we're talking about the big cats or what have you. There's a reason for that, and it has to do with the eating of meat. But we retained an omnivorous diet, which is great because we get the plant world inside of us, And now they want that meat, the meat world inside of them. And I believe that this is connected to the expansion of the brain, where the brain, the cranial capacity now starts expanding at a dramatic rate after Homo habilis has figured out how to just chip away enough of these flakes to tie this thing to the end of a spear and start hunting things.
Are you familiar with the theory that says that when we discovered fire and controlled fire and started cooking meat, then we could spend fewer of our bodily resources on digestion, and that allowed our brains to grow?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Fire too, the domestication of fire. Still, I think the earliest evidence remains Shokotien in China, which is, let's see, what is it? Quite a ways back. It's about contemporary with Homo habilis, just about the same period, maybe Homo erectus. But these guys are the first to begin using stone tools to hunt animals. So they're getting meat into their diet now. The brains then expand. They don't make it out of Africa, Homo habilis, but the next species does, Homo erectus. So Homo erectus does make it out of Africa about 1 million years ago, 1.5 million. They start migrating and they go into China. They discover fire there. They go all over the place, Europe, Asia, especially Asia. So they go everywhere. And now with Homo erectus, we have evidence for, and it's very early and scant in the sense that really with Homo erectus, we discover an aesthetic sensibility that was missing with Homo habilis, and they have a larger cranial capacity. So what they do is they take these stones that they've been using to hunt animals, and they start designing them into these beautiful, aesthetically pleasing implements called Acheulean Handaxes. And their distribution spreads from Europe to India. It doesn't go into China, but it spreads from Europe to India. So now we've got the Acheulean Handaxe, which is quite a bit larger, and it's really too large to use for practical purposes, for hunting animals. And it's very symmetrical, and the flaking on it is beautiful. It's very large. Obviously, these are made now. These are ritual implements now. You can infer that from this, that there's some form of religiosity that's beginning to dawn here with this recognition of the Acheulean Handaxe as a beautiful tool. Plus, most of them don't have any evidence that they've been used. There's no chipping on them that indicates that they've been used for practical purposes. So with Homo erectus, we're already getting a sense that, hey, we're onto something here. Not only do we have meat in our diet from figuring out how to make these spears and so forth, Homo habilis, Homo able handyman, but now with erectus, we have the earliest glimmerings of something that we might call vaguely art in a vague way. There are other indications too, certain beautiful stones that they like to collect and so forth. There are other indications. But this is the lower Paleolithic, and this is what was going on before we got to modern Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals, which are archaic Homo sapiens. With the Neanderthals now, we're going back 600,000 years into Europe. These people are living in Europe. They're very burly, big guys. Their brains are just the same size as ours, except the neocortex isn't as well developed. It slopes back at a flatter angle, which is why Jean Al, in her book, The Clan of the Cave Bear, has them by the modern Homo sapiens called in a racist fashion, flatheads. But yet the brains are, I think, 1,600 cc's, 15 to 1,600 cc's cranial capacity, same as ours. But that neocortex has not been fully developed yet. Nonetheless, we find the earliest evidence for burial there at Atapuerca in Spain. There's a cave there called Cima de los Huesos, the pit of the bones, where we find evidence that they are throwing their dead through a hole in the ground in this cave, and they're just tossing them in there. But without any implements or grave gear or anything, they just throw them into this hole. And that whole idea is like in utero, the idea for what will later become the tomb. The tomb is the analog to the uterus. So from womb to tomb, it's very much involved. It's seen as an alpha and an omega. The life cycle here, the grave burials, you're going back to the mother that brought you into the world, only this is the great mother, not the biological mother now. You're going through a different tunnel, back out. And so that's the earliest evidence we have. And then later, with later Neanderthals, there is evidence of them burying their dead in Palestine, at Shanidar, about 160,000 years ago. They're burying their dead in caves, still in caves at Shanidar. Only now we start finding lots of grave gear associated with these burials, and one in particular who's been thought to be maybe the earliest shaman that we have evidence of, which Al also uses and creates a character based on this burial in her novel, because he had a crippled arm. I think he's called Kreb in the clan of the cave bear, where we find him buried with all these different kinds of herbs like chamomile and stuff that we know has medicinal properties to it. So he's buried with all of this rich array of herbs that are connected with healing. Plus he's deformed. Most shamans are in this early period, and they have to justify their usage to the tribe since they can't go out and hunt with the hunters in some other way. So they do it by accessing the spiritual dimension and opening that up. And these individuals are very feared and revered at the same time, as we've discussed before.
Also very vulnerable, because the band really would credit them for their successes and blame them for their catastrophes and failures.
That's right. That's right. Just as later, notice in Mesopotamia, they will blame the gods for their successes and catastrophes in a similar way. That's interesting, that continuity. But we'll get to that idea. So anyhow, so they're burying their dead. And there is very strong evidence, though this has been officially discredited in the academy, I think they're wrong, that they were worshiping the cave bear. And that because we find in some of the caves in Germany, in the Swiss Alps, and in the Swiss Alps, we find certain caves where there are caches of cave bear skulls, and certain places where they've lined the skulls up and they've put the cave bear skulls into stone, chests, let's say, in the ground. It does look pretty much very strongly like a basic religion is going on here, where they're already worshiping the animal powers, as Joseph Campbell calls it. This is the age of the animal powers. So there's a basic religiosity going on, and there's burial of the dead, and there's some evidence that they are already appreciating art. I think the oldest flute has now been ascribed to Neanderthals, a little bone with a few holes that have been made in it. And there's also evidence now that they were decorating their bodies with red ochre and black manganese. So they were adorning themselves that way. No art yet in what we would call, pictorial images, but still it looks like something like what we would call a human consciousness is now on the scene here. And they have survived for centuries, 600,000 BC, going all the way down here, 100,000 BC. Now we get to 50,000 BC. We're well into the upper Paleolithic now. And then these guys show up on stage. They have migrated about 160,000 years ago. We get evidence in Africa for the first modern Homo sapiens. That's us, who we are. They used to be called Cro-Magnons, but now they're called modern Homo sapiens. So, and we see them migrating out of Africa, and we find the earliest burial attributed to them shortly before the Shanidar burials in Palestine, also at a little cave there too, at another site where there's a woman buried with her dead child, and she's like in a fetal posture, and the only thing they've put on the grave, and this is important, is red ochre. They have sprinkled her body with red ochre. Now the Neanderthals, though they knew about red ochre for adorning their bodies, so far as we know, did not use it in their burials. But from this point on, red ochre is used in burials all the way down through the history of civilization. Eventually it migrates into China, where they substitute it for a different, for cinnabar, actually. But it's red, and it's important that it's red. So then that becomes a point, because later Neanderthals will start picking it up for their later burials, before they become extinct in about 27,000 BC. The last of them appear in Spain, and they're wiped out. So what is this red ochre? And William Aaron Thompson put forth the hypothesis, and I think he may be right, that it represents menstrual blood. It's thought to be because, and you find this all the way down to the Greeks, this belief that the reason why a woman stops menstruating when she gets pregnant is because now her body is using that blood to build the new fetus. So it's constructing the fetus out of that withheld menstrual blood. So if we put red ochre on the body, then we're guaranteeing that the magic power of that menstrual blood is going to reconstruct a new body here for this individual. Again, womb to tomb, the analogy. So red ochre is very important. So we get these burials, and then these people, it looks like for a while they existed peacefully, the Neanderthals and the modern Homo sapiens in Palestine, but eventually by 40,000 BC, they have migrated into Europe. And now things don't look so peaceful, although everything here is based on inference. You have to just sort of infer what's going on here. Suddenly, these people have been there for century after century after century. Suddenly modern Homo sapiens show up. They're smaller, they're gracile, but they're smarter. They have a much more, they're bubbleheads now. They have a much more developed neocortex. I think that's what that term is, what Gene Al picks up in Planet of the Cave Bear.
It's been a while now since I read The Inheritors by William Golding, but it's a beautiful attempt to convey what Golding imagined Neanderthals to be like. It was almost as if they could imagine and obviously feel, but maybe not think in the sense that modern Homo sapiens do.
Yeah, and if you read John E. Pfeiffer's book, The Creative Explosion, he goes into a minute analysis of the differences, but just forgetting that the modern Homo sapiens invent art as we know it. Just forget that. Look at their campsites and the difference in the way modern Homo sapiens would build fires. Like they would figure out this fire technology and build very complicated fire pits compared to the way the Neanderthals did it, which was clumsy, just a circle of stones. I mean, in every respect, and the tool industries just expand. You get all kinds of new ideas. Tools for making tools now come into being, which a concept Neanderthals didn't have. You get new birons, scrapers, awls. The needle is invented so now they're stitching clothing with the bone needle that comes in. In every respect, they are smarter. That's just a fact. So it looks pretty suspicious that by the time these individuals show up in Europe, 40,000 BC, the Neanderthals are extinct by 27,000 BC. It looks like some ethnic cleansing has gone on here. That would be my guess, even though that's not academically, acceptable. I don't care. I just think it's what happened. And we do have evidence of genetic interbreeding as well. Right. So the classic phenomenon of moving into an enemy's territory and raping their women seems to have already been going on here. There is a child burial from just about 27,000 BC in Spain, where the child was buried, and it's half Neanderthal and half modern Homo sapien. So we do have very strong evidence of genetic intermixing. Eric Trinkhaus is the guy who talks about this out here at University of New Mexico. I don't know if he's still there. Trinkhaus says we do have some Neanderthal genes. There's some sort of a dental nerve that we have that Neanderthals had, but that the modern Homo sapiens in Africa did not have, and also a bump on the back of our skulls as well. There again, that modern Homo sapiens have that the modern Homo sapiens in Africa did not have. So there have been some genes that we've taken from the Neanderthals into the gene pool. So that's what the situation looks like to me. So then they come in, and then along about 33,000 BC, we get the invention of art, what we would call properly art with a capital A, now comes in with these modern Homo sapiens. First with the cave of Chauvet, which is the oldest that we know of, 33,000 BC or so. They start drawing pictures of animals on the walls. Some of them are colored, some of them are not. Most of them are not colored. They're very sketchy. They're sort of outlines of animals all over this cave. And then, so now the art is up and running in Western Europe. But see now in Eastern Europe, in the sort of German Eastern European zone, they start, they're not doing painting, they're doing sculpture there. So they start sculpting figurines of horses and mammoths and a definite shaman man lion figure that's about like this, and it's clearly some sort of a cat being standing upright on human legs. And so it looks to me like there were two separate cultures, one of which invented painting, what's called, and the other invents sculpture. So we've got parietal art, and they come together long about 20,000 BC. And when they start, these two cultures discover each other, then we get the real explosion of art. We start getting goddess sculptures on the walls. We start getting in relief at first, and then we start getting the famous goddess sculptures, the little ones, the Venus of Willendorf, which is a masterpiece of art, all these goddess sculptures. So this culture goes on for a while. And then it seems like they come apart in the later period, maybe 16,000 BC.
Do you have any views or any observations or questions that we can just leave unanswered about how the development of the language faculty relates to this stuff? Modern language, the universal grammar that all humans have, the human linguistic faculty that Chomsky probably did more than anyone to characterize. Do you have any views about when that developed, how it relates to maybe the differences between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, whether there's any possibility that it's of fairly recent vintage, that is maybe the last 50,000 years that it really came into being, or at least came into use?
I don't think that you can make those first tools that Homo habilis made without language, because the tool, you pick up one of those stones and you look at it, and now you're projecting a concept at it. You have to be able to form a concept to go, oh, I could flake this and we could use this to go get that animal. And I could, so let's work on it. So clearly, I think language is already up and running by the time of Homo habilis, which puts it back 2 million years ago. But did Australopithecines have language now? That's another issue. They don't seem to have stone tools of any kind or aesthetics or art of any kind, but they were walking around upright, and they did at some point give birth to Homo habilis, as far as we know. It is possible that they were using, I think there has been some evidence that Australopithecines were using bones and or wood as tools, rudimentary tools, because even chimpanzees have a basic knowledge of how to use tools, to get termites out of a hive. You need a stick, but they don't keep the stick with them. They just use the stick for the moment, get the termites, lick the stick, ditch it. So they don't keep it. So there's no concept of longevity. Oh, I may need this tool later on to get the same thing. They don't have that. So I think somewhere in there, in Africa, with Australopithecines and Homo habilis, 2 to 2.5 million years ago, some kind of basic language is emerging here, because I don't think you can do tools without that kind of basic language. Make tools in the complex way that Homo habilis did, not the way chimpanzees do, where they improvise with a rudimentary stick. That's a different thing. That doesn't require language, but this kind of thing does. So I think language goes way, way, way farther back than a lot of these linguists I've heard. It's just too recent. Anyhow, so where we left off was with the invention of art and these two cultures separating. And the one culture goes east, and then it becomes the culture of the mammoth hunters. For a while, we get Dolní Vesnice up and running, where they're building houses now out of mammoth bones, which are pretty cool to look at. They almost look like works of art unto themselves. So they're not living in caves at this point. This is 20,000 BC, roughly, this mammoth hunter site. And they've got shamans there, and they've got, and they're carving figurines of goddesses and so forth. So very complex. But then that culture leaves, and eventually it just migrates across Russia. And you can see the sites as they leave them with the sculptures, various transformations of goddess sculptures that migrate east. So that by the time we get to then the end of the Paleolithic, with the Magdalenian culture, this is a culture that no longer has goddess figurines, no longer is interested in them. They just do the cave art, like the Ordinatian sort of cave art. And the final climax, we get this, the best of all of the painted art appears during this Magdalenian period, and also the most aesthetically pleasing weapons. They've got really interesting weapons that are very aesthetically pleasing. And so what kills them off then is, of course, climate change, the melting of the glaciers, which start kicking in about 14,000 years ago, and the glaciers melt very rapidly. It was very quick change. And some of the caves are now underwater. They've discovered a couple of them that are underwater, and it just ended it. That's it. The climate changes. This world changes. We can no longer do this anymore. So they become nomadic and they migrate. I believe quite a few of them. A lot remain behind, and I think those who remain behind eventually become the Indo-Europeans, who domesticate the horse, and the ones who leave and migrate go into Palestine, and they become the Natufians. And now we're in a new period here, the Neolithic, with the Natufians, who populate all of Palestine, right along the shoreline there. And they are the first, it looks like pretty strongly, to invent agriculture.
I think I remember your saying once that in your view, the melting of the glaciers, that was such an overwhelming challenge that it could not be overcome, that it could not be responded to productively. Because Toynbee talks about how civilizations come into being. And by the way, that's not the subject of our conversation today, what brings civilizations into being. We're focusing on what civilizations are. But Toynbee does say that what brings them into being is a challenge that is neither too great nor too small, the kind of Goldilocks argument. If it's too great, it will crush the civilization and it can't respond. If it's too small, it won't provide the impetus to greatness. Anyway, I just remember you're making an interesting observation that even before high civilization emerged, the melting of the glaciers could be seen as having a sort of catastrophic effect on Magdalenian man, which Magdalenian man could not respond to. Right. And then you just get these offshoots that ultimately become something else, which is what you're about to talk about. The one other thing I wanted to mention, this is something that you've probably known since you were like 7 years old, but I only realized this a few months ago when I was looking into some of these issues. And then it was reinforced when I was in Rome. Okay, lithic means stone, right? So the reason we have like Paleolithic and Neolithic, it's all the Stone Age, right? It's before the Bronze Age, right? Which I know you're going to get into. But that was actually very useful for me because I had heard the term Stone Age, obviously, but I didn't realize that the Paleolithic and the Neolithic were both the Stone Age, the old Stone Age and the new Stone Age, to be followed by the Bronze Age, right? Where you're no longer using stone tools, but instead using these alloys. Relatedly, when I was in Rome, I, among other things, went to the Pantheon, which is unbelievable. The Pantheon is unbelievable.
I bet.
Like, John, you got to see it. Seriously.
I'm jealous.
But monolith is just a huge stone, an undifferentiated piece of stone. And 12 Egyptian monoliths are at the entrance of the Pantheon. Yeah, and I was listening to a tour guide talk about what was required to extract these monoliths and transport them from Egypt to Rome so that they could be erected at the Pantheon. Anyway, the only point I'm making here, it's a complete aside, but lithic and lith, stone. It's good to know that.
Yeah. It is. It is. Although the Neolithic is much more complex. There's lots of other stuff like mud bricks and so forth, and pottery eventually. It is subdivided into, like, for academics, the boring terms are PPN A, pre-pottery Neolithic A, which is from the Natufians down to about 8,000 BC, and then pre-pottery Neolithic B, which is from about 8,000 to 6,000. And then the pottery Neolithic proper is 6,000 BC-ish when we start getting actual pottery coming in.
So why does that distinction matter so much?
Because it's so ubiquitous. There was some rudimentary pottery, by the way, at Dolní Věstonice. They did have some clay bowls, but it's not developed and it's not elegant because pottery over time becomes, by the time it starts appearing with the Obidians, let's say, and the Halafians in Sumer, 6,000 BC, it's the best pottery that's ever been invented. It's so aesthetically beautiful and perfectly made. And they've got brand new kinds of kilns, double chambered kilns, which enable firing at higher temperatures that can bring in a much more refined form of pottery. They put a lot of thought into this. And pottery becomes a marker for culture, for basic, these kinds of cultures, village cultures, let's say. It's not cities yet, these are villages. And so one of the main inventions here with the Natufians is the village. Dolní Věstonice was a kind of village, sort of, but it's all made out of bones. But here with the Natufians, they're building village sites near the Euphrates in Syria. We get Miraibet and Yerf al-Amar and places like that, where we find the first evidence of rye and einkorn seeds being planted in the ground. But it's also located near gazelle migration routes. So they're still thinking like hunters. They're like, oh, this is a good place for us to camp because we know the gazelle are going through here on a regular basis. So they're still thinking like hunters, but they park it there. They're within range of the gazelles, but now the climate has changed and they have access to all these new grasses, rye, barley, wheat, emmer, all that. And they figure it out. They just figure out, oh, we could park here. And now we start finding the first pestles and mortars coming in. So it's pretty clear that the Natufians about 12,000 BC are inventing agriculture and villages. So that becomes now the basis, because the Paleolithic, these people are all nomads. And sometimes those caves were seasonally occupied. So they're in and out of these caves, depending on the seasons and where the game is at. So they're always moving around. It's nomadic. But for the first time, culture just roots to a specific spot and parks there.
Right. And these villages, I think a lot of them, or maybe all of them, were close to water sources, right? So that
Yes,
people
the
could
Euphrates.
fish, so that they could fish and hunt and farm, right? They were
Yep.
doing all of it, right? It
Yes.
wasn't like some clean break, obviously, from
Right. Yeah.
hunting and gathering. Yeah.
The early Natufian villages, by the way, are made out of stones. It's like they're kind of making stone igloos. That's sort of what they look like. Little houses made out of stones in round shapes. So they still haven't figured out mud bricks yet. And the mud bricks come actually from Jericho, further south from Jericho, which is up and running by 10,000 BC. And they are the first to invent mud brick architecture, where you take mud and you put the straw in it and then put it out to dry. And now you can build a house with it. So we start then getting, first off, and one of the distinctions between these pre-pottery Neolithic A and B is the distinction between curvilinear architecture, where the first houses are always round. They're always in circles. Again, that's a uteromorphic idea, whereas rectangular architecture starts coming in around 8,000 BC and becomes a demarcator for pre-pottery Neolithic B now. They're using a different kind of architecture because they have access to different technologies now for building houses. And we start seeing villages become rectilinear with rectangles everywhere. Every house is made in the form of either a square or a rectangle. And we start seeing the invention of rooms, the concept of splitting off one room from another room on the inside, whereas the Natufian houses were just sort of, caves, basically, portable caves. And they have art, but it's not that. Natufian art is not very impressive. They have these little sculpted figurines, no goddesses, significantly enough. No goddesses, some animals and some basic forms, but no goddesses. Their art's not very impressive or interesting. And the second phase of the Natufians, they're responding to another, what's called the Younger Dryas warming period. So they put more energy into technology than art in the second period because they have to respond to what's called actually a mini ice age. There's a mini ice age that appears about 10,000 BC called the Younger Dryas warming. And so that's it for the Natufians, really. And then the Neolithic is up and running, and villages start springing up like mushrooms all over the Middle East and over Mesopotamia. You just start seeing them sprout up everywhere. And so we're thoroughly in the Neolithic. And the worship then slowly shifts, as far as I can tell, it shifts from an emphasis on animals to plants. And not only that, but to human sacrifice starts coming in at the village of Chayonu, which I think is located in eastern Turkey, if I remember right, or maybe it's Syria. 8,000 BC, we start finding human skulls being collected everywhere. And this did appear at Jericho too. As Jericho was up and running 10,000 BC, and we get at Jericho, the first sort of attempt at, well, not the first, but the second, let's say, because a recent one has been filmed, attempt at doing something monumental with the architecture. There's a stone tower at the site of Jericho that's, I think it's like 30 feet tall, and it's just on one side of the wall of the settlements, and it's made out of mud brick, and it has a flat top with a staircase on the inside. So you would go up, I think 30 steps to get to the top of this tower. And initially it was thought that it might have been built for defense as a kind of fortification. Maybe there were archers on the top of this tower that they could shoot out at. Kathleen Kenyon was the archaeologist who put forth all of this. She was the one who first dug it up. But the tower is, if it were for fortification, you would think that it would be on the inside of the wall, but it isn't. It's on the outside of the wall. And so there's suspicion that it might have been used for ritual purposes. So there's that possibility that it's almost like a premonition of the coming idea of the ziggurat, where you have to go up all these stone steps to meet with the gods. So it might be already tending in that direction.
So human sacrifice predates the development of high civilization, but it does seem to coincide with a shift in religious ideation from the animal powers to seated earth, a shift in food acquisition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. I was just thinking, okay, why would human sacrifice connect, or why would it coincide with agriculture? And it occurred to me that maybe it's because human beings become more dependent and more regularly dependent on the weather. That is a kind of fickle, uncontrollable force than they were when they were hunter-gatherers. And that led to this idea that we have to propitiate the gods through these extreme measures. Do you have a kind of Cliff's Notes account of the origins of human sacrifice, like why it came into being when it did?
The reason why it comes into being now, and we don't find it at every one of these sites, though. That's the problem. At Chionu, you can infer it. It's pretty definite. There are caches of human skulls. There is a particular building in which they have found flint blades with human blood stains on them, and certain kinds of what look like altars that also are stained with human blood. So it's pretty clear that they were sacrificing human beings at Chionu, 8000 BC. And it comes into being because it's connected with the myth of the primary myth of the agrarian world. And this is a myth that you can find all across the Pacific, for example, is that killing the sacred person, let's say, to use Agamben's term, Homo sacer, the sacred person is a reenactment of the original myth that brought our food to us, where a human being was sacrificed or killed, pulled apart. Maybe the head was cut off. There's a Polynesian myth that the coconut tree has emerged from a guy whose head was cut off, and his girlfriend had to plant it like a seed in the ground, and the coconut tree grew up from the head. So that's why the coconuts look like human heads. But it's a very common myth associated with agrarian societies, that the sacrifice represents the original sacrifice that took place at the beginning of time, that brought death into being, but also brought our food plants into being. And you can find this all amongst Native American societies who are agrarian. They also have the same myth, that there was a fundamental, original, willing sacrifice of a being that gave itself and was planted. And then later there are echoes of this in the Osiris myth. Osiris is sacrificed and becomes the god of the earth, from out of whose body food plants come. There's one version of it where he's torn apart, and then Isis goes around, and every time she finds a piece of his body, she plants it, and then corn plants spring up out of it. So that's the reason why there's a shift there to a different mythological system, whereas with the way of the animal powers, the animal is the sacrifice that you're dealing with and is offered up. The cave bear that the Neanderthals clearly worshiped, they were collecting cave bear skulls, not human skulls. Now we find human skulls turning up everywhere. At Jericho especially, what they're doing at Jericho is you find human skulls that they have redecorated, minus the jawbone in most cases, that they've put lime plaster on with little shells for eyes, and lime plaster over the skull, and they decorate it. And it's a way of keeping in contact with the dead. So we have a cult now of what I believe to be the shift from the animal powers to ancestor worship. The dead are everywhere in these societies and amongst these villages. We find skulls worshipped. We find them lined up along the floor at different villages. They're everywhere. And so it looks like the skull cult now is fully up and running, and it is displaced, along with the myth of human sacrifice and this plant god that comes out of that sacrifice. It's displaced the animal powers myth. They're still hunting animals, of course, but the primary mythology has shifted. That has now become peripheral to the civilization. And so, although these aren't civilizations yet, so we're getting to our distinction. The Paleolithic, if we look back, is not a civilization. We do have art. That's clear, and that is one of the characteristics of civilization, but it is by no means the defining characteristic, since most human societies have some form of art and ritual and myth. So those aren't defining characteristics of a civilization. What we have is a society in the Paleolithic. This is a social formation that's tribal in its orientation, and the media are based on orality. So from a media studies look, we have orality here. And when you have Aboriginal or indigenous tribal societies, they're almost invariably based on oral communications and oral recitation. You got to go to the guy who has studied all the myths of the tribe, the Homer or whoever, who will then do the performance. He'll be the performer for that night's festivities. They'll all sit around the fire and listen to this guy talk, and he'll tell all the tales and myths of the tribe, but it's all coming out of the mouth. There's no writing in these societies, and writing, which is what I'm working up to, is really the non-negotiable defining characteristic for civilization, because it makes all kinds of other things possible, including higher mathematics. I'm sure these societies had basic arithmetic, basic mathematics. You have to in order to build things, but not higher mathematics. And you can't have higher mathematics without writing, because you have to be able to write this stuff down and keep track of what you're doing. And so writing, mathematics, astronomy, or astronomy and astrology were not really differentiated by the Sumerians. It's the same thing. And of course, a cosmological world image, but you have to have writing and astronomy and mathematics, higher mathematics. So the Sumerians invent the systems that we still use today, the decimal system and the sexagesimal system, units based on 60s and units based on 10s. That was developed by the Sumerians. And that is what enabled them, that shift into that higher mind is what enabled them to build their giant temples and ziggurats. These things are huge and they are monumental right from the start, right from 3500 BC. So what I was working up to here through the Neolithic, the ancestor cults sort of die out when we get to Pottery Neolithic proper, 6000 BC in Mesopotamia. Lots of villages still, but the technology has shifted to double-chambered kilns. So we get all this pottery starts springing up everywhere, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's the best pottery that's ever been made, and it's not made on a wheel. The wheel actually, by mass producing pottery, destroys it. So the wheel comes in later, around 4000 BC. The wheel itself as a concept first starts appearing on little toys that we find in Mesopotamia. It's 4000 BC, and also the pottery wheel, about 4000 BC, but it brings in the end of this highly developed pottery between these two societies that were rivals with each other, the Halafians, who were in the north, in the forested uplands of eastern Turkey, and in the south, on the alluvial plain between the rivers, we have the Samarans, not the Sumerians, but the Samarans who are competing with them. So we have Samaran pottery, and we have, and in the uplands, we have Halafian pottery, and they're both equally beautiful. And it's clear that they were trying to rival each other. Who could do the best pottery? And the ancestor cult seems to die out. The skull cults, except in certain places amongst the Halafians, who are conservators, seems to die out and go away. So now with the Pottery Neolithic, there's a shift in the religious mentality. They're sort of moving away from the ancestor cults. Not only that, but they're starting to bury their dead not on the insides of their villages under the floors where they sleep anymore. They're putting them in separate cemeteries now over there. The Samarans especially are doing this. The dead are over there. They have their own home. We live here. So now we're starting to get a differentiation and a distinction between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living, which I think is the fundamental factor that brings high civilization into being. Because when they're so intermixed with us, I'm sleeping above my dead grandfather. The dead are, with ancestor worship, as in China, they say no to everything. Anything new, any innovation that comes into being, when you're cozy with the dead, they're going to say, no, we don't need these. We don't need innovation, which is one of the reasons why China has been the way it has been about technology. Very, very suspicious about it. It's like they'll have a technological innovation, and then they'll say, no, never mind, let's get rid of it. Let's burn all the books.
Like gunpowder.
Yeah, exactly. It's back and forth with them. They have that conscience, and that conscience is their filial piety cults telling them, no, we don't need this. It's an insult to the founding ancestors.
I just wanted to observe that what you're saying, your account of what brings civilization into being, beautifully intersects with Toynbee's definition of civilization. Toynbee has a whole section where he says, okay, what distinguishes civilization? It's not this, it's not this, it's not this. Then he comes to his conclusion, which is that it has to do with whether the mimesis is toward the dead or toward a living creative minority.
Right. I remember he uses some sort of metaphor about climbing up over a ledge, where you can stay stuck in the past below that ledge, or climb up and move into the new, the realm of innovation. So in order for that to be possible, you have to get rid of the deference to the ancestors who conserve the forms, what I call the archive, the founding archetypes that make culture possible. It's their job to conserve those forms, which is the reason why, ancestor worship societies like the Australian Aborigines, with the founding ancestors, the Wangina in the dream time, they had their mouths stripped from them. So when you look at their art, these creatures don't have mouths because mouths pronounce the words that make new forms. So in the dream time, the ancestors already made all the new forms. We don't need any new culture. We don't need any new technology. We're self-sufficient with what we have. And so societies which do put the mimesis, as you put it, to the dead remain stuck in the past. And the ones who let go of the cult of the dead are the ones who move forward into a new mimesis, the mimesis of the creative minority now that starts coming in. So I believe it was this fundamental separation between the cult of the dead and the realm of the living and the creation of separate cemeteries. And that all starts happening around 6000 BC, all over, amongst the Halafians in the forested uplands, as well as in the south and on the alluvial plain where the Samarans are existing, doing all this beautiful pottery and inventing all these new kilns. And they have been working with copper. Copper is the oldest of the metals to be dug up and played around with. Even at Chionu, we start 8000 BC, we're finding them with little copper trinkets, little beads made out of copper, and it seems to have begun as jewelry. So they start using the metal copper in these villages very early on. It goes way back, but it's used just for jewelry, not really for any practical purposes. It takes them a long time to figure out how to use copper for anything practical. It's a soft metal, so there's only certain things you can do with it. But along about 4000 BC, they start figuring out how to mix it with tin to produce bronze. And now we start getting bronze spears, bronze knives. You know, that now we're in the mode of high civilization. The cult of the ancestors is gone. And now we have this pantheon of gods who have replaced them. Sky gods. The entire Sumerian pantheon is associated with planets, every single one of them. Inanna is the planet Venus. Marduk later on, the Babylonian god Marduk is associated with Jupiter. They're all associated with the planets. So what Campbell calls the way of the celestial lights. So that also means that there's a priesthood here who's keeping very careful track of the stars. And we have astronomy, astrology, and mathematics. Those are all tied in together. And writing comes in at first in Uruk, the city of Uruk, 3500 BC, to keep track of donations to the temple. So it comes into being for strictly business reasons. And they're writing it on clay. So they're just taking clay from the river and making smooth out a little tablet. And then you take a stylus, a little stick. And at first it's pictographic. So they're drawing little pictures, 3500 BC, but they soon start realizing the problem with that medium is that your hand will smudge the pictures. So they very quickly shift to this little sort of Morse code ... thing that they're doing. And their writing just looks like a collection of dots with the stylus. So that's cuneiform. But it was pictographic at first for a little while, a couple of centuries. Whereas the Egyptians, on the other hand, didn't have that problem. They were using papyrus. And so they could write these cool little pictographic hieroglyphs on the papyrus. A couple of centuries, about 3200 BC in Egypt, which just precedes, note, the birth of civilization there about 3000 BC. So writing has been up and running in Egypt for about 2 centuries before then high civilization is born there as well. And then they start building their burial mounds, and their mummification processes start producing these mastabas that start developing and get larger. And pretty soon they get stacked into tiers. And we get the first true pyramid with the 3rd dynasty Pharaoh Zoser, which is a stepped pyramid because these are steps that you go up like a ladder to the gods. That was the idea. And then pretty soon with the 4th dynasty, they want them smooth now. It's more aesthetically pleasing to put a limestone casing that smooths out the steps and makes them smooth, so that you get this idea of gliding that Spengler says is essential to the fundamental idea of Egypt, with their concept of the way as their primary symbol, the creation of a smooth surface that you just glide across into eternity. So I think then getting back to our initial question, civilization is distinct from previous social formations in those respects. That you've got to have writing or you don't have a civilization. So with the media studies tradition founded by Marshall McLuhan and Harold Innis, they have these stages as well, only they look at the history of civilization only from the point of view of the changes in media. Orality is first, that's what they call it. And it makes possible certain aspects of the mind cognitively that writing then, when it comes in, changes. Writing rewires the brain. It actually creates a new, more abstract mental phase space where you can think in a more abstract way than you could with orality. And you think in a different way. Walter Ong has an excellent book on this called Orality and Literacy, where he outlines the differences in the cognitive mentalities between the two.
One really important difference is that memory becomes less necessary, right?
Yes, in a literate culture. Yep. You don't have to worry so much about memory. This was Plato's warning about it in his little myth of King Thomas, who says, well, men won't have to rely on their memory anymore. It'll be stored up in the archives. But yes, that's precisely the point. And now we can have access to much more knowledge than we could before, because now we have these libraries. And the Mesopotamians had the first libraries where you find these rows of clay tablets on shelves at places like Mari and Ebla, rows of clay tablets. These are the earliest archives and libraries where knowledge is stored.
And human beings retain a high capacity for memory, even as we shift from orality. You're a very good example of that, but also one person I'm reminded of is Solzhenitsyn basically wrote the Gulag Archipelago in his head. And that seems inconceivable to the contemporary mind, but it would not have surprised someone of Homer's epic that someone could store all of that information in their mind and then basically just write it out when they got out of the Gulag.
Right. And the other thing with writing too is that the myths and tales tend to be committed to writing. Usually writing is there before them. But it is often the case that once writing arrives on the scene, the myths and tales are committed to writing pretty quickly because there's a fear of losing them, of forgetting them, which means they are being forgotten. So the orality people are not teaching, it's not being passed down the generations like it used to be. Something has changed in the society which has caused it to become anxious about losing the myths. And I think this is why Homer wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey, because there was a shift in the society now, and the old oral versions of it were being forgotten, and the bards weren't singing them anymore. That's normally the reason why myths become committed to writing. Same thing in Egypt, writing. Those pyramids are not decorated with writing until the 5th dynasty in the Pyramid of Unas. Then they start committing what are called the pyramid texts, which are the oldest written texts in Egypt, 2600 BC, to writing by carving them on the walls. So now they're eternal. Once we carve these magical spells for reviving the pharaoh in the afterlife, so he can navigate his way through the afterlife with the usage of these spells, we don't have to have the priests come in here anymore. They're stored up on the walls of the pyramids now. So that is when they start putting their myths. In this case, it's really the pyramid texts are almost all magical spells that are impossible to understand as you're reading them. You have no idea what the context is, but all the gods are in there. All the basic Egyptian gods from the Old Kingdom are in there. So normally people start committing their myths and tales when they're very worried about them being forgotten for some reason. Something's going on. So now we need writing to store them, so we make sure that they're preserved.
Tell me if this is an accurate distilled synthesis of what you've said so far. So the fundamental innovation of civilization, the foundation for all subsequent innovations, is writing.
Yes.
You also think that the religious shift that opens a society to such innovations is moving the burial site from underneath the home within the village to outside. So shifting the burial sites outside the village opens a society to innovation. And the key innovation was writing. And then many other innovations followed from that. Is that?
Yeah, mathematics is very closely tied into, because with the invention of writing at Uruk, those priests need to keep track of the temple donations. So they're already using writing with together basic mathematics to add things up and keep track of them in sums and who owes what and so forth. So it comes into being for mercantile reasons in Sumer, although these are priests. I mean, yes, it's mercantile, but it's also religious. And then in Egypt, it comes into being in connection with their tombs. We find the earliest hieroglyphs inscribed on little bone or ivory plaques from the tomb of the Scorpion King in 3200 BC. So there it comes into being strictly in a funerary religious context. But then it gets up and running in both civilizations, and we've got Toynbee's first generation here, where now we're onto something with this. We can store all this knowledge in these archives. If you need to know something, go look it up in the archives. We've got mathematics that can enable us to think, keep track of the planets, and know where the stars are at, know how to align temples in relation to the stars, which is what they're all doing at this time. So all this is like a huge cluster. It's like a mutation, like one of Gebser's mutations, you know, the mythical consciousness structure. Suddenly it's just there, and it has all these components to it, like a living organism does. When we look back through the history of geology at living organisms, they always appear, they're already complex. The earliest cells are already complex. They've got all kinds of little components inside of them. So that's it. And it's, I believe the key thing was leaving the dead behind in Mesopotamia, which was never really the case in Egypt because their whole culture is based on worship of the dead. So in a certain sense, Egypt is, and it shows between the two civilizations, Egypt is much more conservative and less receptive to new technological ideas than Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was always the innovator. They invented writing. The Egyptians get it after them, probably from them. Metals arrived very late in Egypt. It's mostly a stone-based civilization for a very long time. They built those pyramids using stones and stone tools, and their pottery is stone. Their statues are stone. Bronze comes relatively late, and ironworking, don't even bother. I mean, it's not, that's, but bronze comes very late to the civilization. There's some early copper working, but the Egyptians were extremely conservative. The wheel does not arrive there until the Hyksos invasions in 1500 BC, as we've seen. They were pretty conservative. By comparison with Mesopotamia, which was a much less stable society, something bad was always happening there, but something new was always happening as well, because they were much more, I think the Mesopotamians had, you know, let go of the cult of the dead in a way that the Egyptians never did.
And it's so interesting to make an updated comparison between, say, China and Mesoamerican civilizations on the one hand and Western civilization on the other, because the stereotype is that Western civilization is more innovative, and that particularly China, the comparison is often drawn between the West and China, who will win. And one argument that is still made is that there's just something in Chinese culture that inhibits the kind of innovation that we've seen in the West, right? But of course, they're more of an ancestor worshiping society even to this day. So it's another kind of Egypt Mesopotamia comparison potentially. I don't want to overdraw.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to overstate that, but there might be something to that.
Yeah, it's a very similar. Egypt is much more conservative and backward oriented and sort of stuck in the past in a certain sense, and very slow to pick up the new stuff, whereas Mesopotamia is always rushing on to the next development. And history begins at Sumer, is how the great Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer called it. History begins at Sumer. They are the ones who stepped across that mimesis threshold, left the dead behind, and suddenly started innovating. We get the first monumental temples in the world, 3500 BC, at places like Uruk and Ur and Eridu. These are huge already, right from the start, with the writing and the mathematics and the star gods, who are now, not only are the gods associated with the planets, that each one of them is associated with a different technology. There's a patron god for the making of mud bricks, a spider goddess. Inanna is the patron of astronomy. Enki, the god of Eridu, which is the southernmost at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, is associated with the watery abyss, the Apsu, and with the invention of irrigation. And so each one of these gods is the patron of one or another technology. Nanasin, the primary god, who's a moon god of Ur, which is up the street from Uruk, is associated with boat building. And this is why their boats have crescent shapes. They're moon boats. The classic Mesopotamian boat has a crescent shape to it, even to this day, with the peasants in the region who live, like the marsh dwellers who live in the south there. They still have the crescent shape to the boat. It's meant to imitate the shape of the moon. So all these gods are associated with both planets and technologies. And so we're in a technological world here. We're in a world here where the ancestor worship is behind us, because they're always going to say no to any new innovation. So we have their discouragement we don't have to worry about. So the Mesopotamians are the first to step across this threshold. And this is why all of this happens.
Can you say a little bit about how the worship of male and female deities connects to the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic to high civilization? Because, for example, I'm aware that a lot of Neolithic cultures worshipped goddesses, right? And most of the preeminent sky gods were male. And so just bringing in that angle, I think, might be interesting.
Right. And so it is generally true. It's a stereotype and a cliche, but the Neolithic farming villages had the goddess as the primary religious figure. That's true in most cases, but not in all of them. As we have seen, the Natufians who invented agriculture don't have any goddess figurines. So the goddess is absent there right at the start of the birth of agriculture. So it's not in every case. So that caveat should be taken into account, but it does tend to be predominant that there are very few villages where you're not going to find some version of a goddess carving, because the mother is analogized to the Mother Earth, the woman who gives birth, while the earth also gives birth. And now we're worshiping the earth because we're locked in place like plants, and we're imitating the plants, rooted to one spot. And so we're worshiping the plants, and the earth is the mother. So usually in later cosmologies, the earth is Mother Earth, except in Egypt, which is interesting, where they reverse it, where the earth is Jeb, or the earth god, and the sky is the mother, Nut. But the Egyptians retained, with their conservatism, a very strong matrilinearity. It mattered that you were descended from a certain woman, not a man, if you were going to be in any position of rulership. So they were very matrilineal. And so they retained even though we do get a lot of myths in Egypt of sort of gender wars between Isis, let's say, and Re, the sun god. She gets him drunk one day to get his secret name out of him because he won't give her his secret name. And if you have somebody's secret name, you have magical powers over them, because the magical consciousness structure remains very strong in Egypt, simmering just below the mythical that has been laid recently on top of it. She gets him drunk and she gets the name out of him. So there are a lot of myths in Egypt where you can see power struggles. And there are, though, female pharaohs, though pharaohs usually are male, right down the line, not just Hatshepsut. I've heard some scholars say that Hatshepsut was the only female pharaoh. She absolutely was not. It is very clear there were at least a few others, 3 or 4. There were probably 5 female pharaohs through the history of the civilization. And you can infer this by looking at the inscriptions and so forth. And it is also clear that Akhenaten regarded his wife Nefertiti as a co-ruler with him. And when he died, she took charge of everything. So the goddess worship remains very strong in Egypt, not so much in Mesopotamia for a while. It does with Inanna. Inanna is one of the key divinities that's absolutely indispensable to that civilization. But it changes once the Babylonians come in. And the Babylonians are tough. They originate as a barbarian war band, the Amorites, who eventually take over the entire society under Hammurabi the Great. The Babylonians more or less correspond to the Romans. They are the universal state of this civilization. They're Semitic, they're warriors. They're not too sympathetic to goddesses. And so we start getting a shift where people's names are often embody goddess names, like the great Sumerian Ur-Nammu. Nammu was a goddess. And so he names himself Ur-Nammu, and he is the great during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, when they're trying to restore Sumerian civilization after it's been conquered by the Akkadians under Sargon of Akkad. They're trying to restore it. And he is kind of like the Ramses II figure of this civilization, where he's going around building the biggest ziggurats that have ever been built, just like Ramses built the largest Egyptian monuments that have ever been built, Ramses II. And so you stop seeing that. The names of all the Babylonian rulers are taken from men, male deities, never female deities, not in any case, if you look at the inscriptions. And then the myths are about, and you can see on some of the art where the coronation was originally given, the rod and the ring, representing the ecliptic on the one hand and the pole star on the other, has to be handed to the ruler by the goddess Inanna. She is who confers the right to rule on a Sumerian ruler, but that mythology changes with the Babylonians. It's a man, it's Marduk, who now confers the right, the rod and the ring on the ruler to rule. So there is a gradual shift in these civilizations from an emphasis on, I wouldn't say matriarchy, but I would say matrilinearity to patrilinearity within these civilizations, especially Mesopotamia.
I think there's probably something to the idea that where women play a more important role in basic food and resource acquisition, female deities are more likely to be primary. And so going from hunting and gathering to farming, especially before the plow, men were the fundamental food providers. Yes, women did the gathering, they did the cooking, but men went and got the meat. And if that didn't happen, everyone does. Whereas when you're farming, men and women are tilling the soil and laying the seed.
If you're using the hoe, I think either sex can participate, but not with the plow. With the plow, it's too heavy. It requires too much strength. And the plow comes in, and it's invented by the god Ninurta. So Ninurta is a hero warrior god who's similar actually to the later Babylonian Marduk, who slays the goddess, the world goddess, and creates the universe out of her body. Already you have the man doing the creating there in that myth. So we're on the way to the Old Testament there, not the woman. The universe doesn't give birth to itself as it does in some of these older cosmologies, which are much more closely tied to the soil. Just like Hesiod, it's like the difference between Hesiod's Theogony and Homer's Iliad, where all the stuff that's going on in the Iliad is all men. But with Hesiod was a farmer, unlike Homer, who was a seaman, and Hesiod was a farmer and much more closely tied into old Boeotian agrarian myths. And so in the Theogony, he begins with Gaia, the earth goddess, just spontaneously giving birth to the world. It just comes out of her. So he's in possession of access to these much older agrarian myths, whereas Homer is bringing in these, all the Indo-European sky gods, Zeus, these thunder hurling gods. Thor in Scandinavia has the hammer that's the thunderbolt. The sky gods they have come down from the north to fertilize the second generation of civilization, where now we do get sky gods all over the place. Whereas before there had been an emphasis primarily on earthly deities, terrestrial deities. But of course, we've already seen that the Sumerian gods were linked with the planets as well. So there is that aspect. But the thing with those invasions is that it changes the myths, and the myths become much more aggressive. You get these warrior men who come in with thunderbolts and fight previous generations of gods, as in the Theogony, as it unfolds, it moves into Zeus moving in and conquering the Titans, and the Titans are connected to the farming cults. They're all depicted as monsters when the generation of Zeus moves in and overthrows them and shoves them all down into the underworld. That's because you've got new cults coming in that have been brought in by the Indo-Europeans now that put this emphasis on thunder hurling male warrior deities now that have come in to displace them. And so, it depends on what phase of civilization we're talking about, but it has been a gradual pushing out of the goddess cults and bringing in the masculine warrior hero cults.
There's a crude analogy to be drawn between the shift from hunting and gathering to farming, at least farming with the hoe, not with the plow, and the shift from the 1950s American household to the contemporary American household. Because in the 1950s, the man was the breadwinner and the woman, at least stereotypically, stayed at home and, took care of hearth and home. So not a very different division of labor than that which existed in the hunting and gathering societies. Whereas now, in the case of the contemporary educated Western urban classes, women often make just as much as, if not more than the man. That is, in terms of basic resource and food acquisition, they are as important as men, if not more important. It's also the case, somewhat coincidentally, that we're in something like the era of the new religiousness, and new religious worldviews are kind of a dime a dozen and on offer. And if you think that social justice and wokeism is a kind of new religion that is very popular among precisely that group of people, it's a lot of stereotypically or archetypally feminine impulses put into an ideology.
I think of wokeism as an ideology, not a religion. I don't think it has any kind of religious content or basis to it. It's just an ideology, like communism, let's say. It's programming, brainwashing. I don't see it as having any kind of
Well, I mean,
religious, you know.
it's interesting that you say that though, because there's a pretty extensive body of literature at this point making the argument that social justice is at a minimum very much like a religion, and some
It's a parody. It's a parody of a religion. That's what. Just as communism is a parody of a religion. Instead of a sacred book, you have Das Kapital. That becomes the sacred book, and instead of an apocalypse, we have the eventual overthrow of the workers that will eventually rise up to overthrow their bourgeois employers. So it becomes a parody of a religion. Gotcha. And has been substituted, let's say, in China, in place of a religious mentality. So it can be slotted into that semiotic vacancy that used to be occupied by a religion, but it isn't a religion. It's a caricature.
Gotcha.
Not a very good one.
That's actually quite complementary or similar to what I think Jordan Peterson would say. He calls them ideologies too, and he says that they are parasitic on the religious impulse, but not worthy of the name religion.
On the group aspect of it, that bonds, because we don't have much social cohesion anymore. So people want to know what's going to hold my tribe together, what's my identity. And so it becomes a replacement for what used to hold people together, which used to be religion. That used to be the thing that bonded us together. But now the society is disintegrating, so we don't have an overarching religious structure anymore. And so people are looking for ways that they can belong and feel important. I'm important if I identify my tribe as such, whatever that tribe happens to be. And that gives me a feeling of belonging to a community, and it lifts me up and makes me feel important. And people right now don't feel important. They feel diminished and weakened by the civilizational mega machine, which is impossibly large. It's never been this huge in history ever. And it has the tendency to diminish people's sense of worthiness. Oh, what am I in the face of these skyscrapers, right, or in the face of this industry? I'm just a cog here.
And nihilism is rampant. It doesn't go by that name, but it's basically the default worldview in the world that I inhabit.
Yes. Yeah. And the human psyche is not made for nihilism. We've just seen that, a brief view of human history here. It's always based on some form of religiosity and some form of finding meaning through sacrality, through the sacred.
With regard to writing, there are different kinds of writing, as you noted. You have pictographic, and then you have what we might call aniconic.
The alphabet is aniconic. That's
right.
Because the entire Hebrew mentality is aniconic.
What about Sumerian writing? Where would that fit in? Because it's not pictographic, right? Or at least cuneiform.
Sumerian writing, as we've said, started pictographically, and then they realized smudging the images. So then it shifts to cuneiform, which is just dots.
Would that qualify as aniconic?
No, it was expedient to the medium because of the smearing. It was merely technical. It had nothing to do, because the whole civilization is iconic in every other aspect.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay. With the Hebrews, it's a different matter, because the whole idea is that this is the world's first invisible God. They had to come up with something fresh, because they're stuck in between two old dying civilizations. The Egyptians on the one hand, who were thoroughly iconic with an iconic pictographic script, hieroglyphs, and the Sumerians on the other hand with their iconic civilization. So they came up with the innovation of a portable God who's invisible. So you don't depict him in any images. Thou shalt not make any graven images of anything, actually. And so an art tradition never develops amongst the Hebrews for that reason. There really is no such thing as Jewish art. It doesn't exist as such.
So when we're talking about what civilization is, though, writing is the fundamental innovation. It doesn't matter so much whether it's pictographic or aniconic.
No, but I do think it does matter in the sense of the more abstract writing makes possible, I think, higher, more abstract ways of thinking. And I think the alphabet, the Greeks pick it up, eventually the Hindus pick it up as well, makes possible, may have something to do with making the second generation as a philosophical generation possible. Because of its abstract nature, it's become less tied to the senses and the physical world and more abstract. It's phonetic. It's based on sounds, not images that you can picture in your heads. And so it may have something to do with the birth of philosophy and moving into a much more, an even more abstract mental phase space than what hieroglyphs and cuneiform had made possible before. It may also have to do, as we have said, with the Indo-Aryan invasions and the Indo-Europeans injecting all this energy into the culture. But the thing about those, most of those peoples were not literate, did not have writing, the Indo-Aryans. And this affects India tremendously, because India, in a certain respect, is an atavism in this sense that most of their myths and tales were orally told and transmitted from one guru to his disciple, who memorizes it and transmits it. And it's just all this memorization that's going on that wasn't really committed to writing until the British got there. And that's when they started. The British are the ones who are responsible for bringing Indian texts over to the West. We wouldn't even have those texts if the British did not invade India and set up their Raj there. It just wouldn't. And so they started making all these pandits and gurus and sannyasins. They would interview them about, let's say, the Ramayana. Let's get the whole thing in writing. And so they would interview different guys, and they would all recite the same oral tradition with a few different recensions maybe, but basically the same. So India performed a prodigious feat of memory. It's absolutely astonishing that most of these sacred texts were not committed to writing for centuries and centuries and centuries, but were simply passed down orally. That's mind-blowing. Even though India did inherit writing in the alphabet long about 600 BC, it did migrate there, but it was mostly for administrative purposes, not for the writing down of the myths.
It's really interesting. And going back to writing for a second, if we return to our basic framework, what do all civilizations have in common? What is a civilization? And then how do they differ? We could say that one thing they all have in common is writing. And we're not going to distinguish between the type of writing. It doesn't seem to matter for the basic ingredients of civilization to have a particular type of writing. It's just important that you have writing, whether it's hieroglyphs or cuneiform or an alphabet. But then in later conversations, when we talk more about differences between civilizations, the type of writing really does matter. As you say, aniconic writing could lead to philosophy, for example.
Yeah, that's what I suspect.
What are all the places where writing in whatever form independently emerged?
I don't think it was ever independent. I think it just started in Mesopotamia and it spread to Egypt, and then it spread east, eventually migrated to Persia and India and China, and then across the water to Mesoamerica. I think you can track its diffusion. I don't think it ever emerged independently anywhere but Mesopotamia.
If that's the case, there were certain places to which it never diffused, right?
The Incan civilization, which is a civilization, is the only one we know of where we don't have writing from them. But we can't be 100% sure because the Spaniards were burning everything in sight. And so there may have been writing amongst the Incan civilization that we've lost. Whereas Mesoamerica, they've burned nearly all their texts and codices and so forth. So we've lost probably 98% of their literature. Very little has survived at all. And except for, the one epic, the Popol Vuh, and then inscriptions, because those are carved in stone. So we have lots of inscriptions that are carved in stone, and their mathematics, very elaborate astronomical mathematical systems. All that is carved in stone. So we know those systems, they're carved in stone. And but not much in the way of actual writing has survived from that civilization, and nothing from the Incan civilization. So the Incan civilization is a bit, there's always this one irritating thing that doesn't fit your idea, and you have to figure out how to squirm it in there, because it is possible that maybe Incan civilization is the only one that never had writing.
Yeah, I think I've heard it said that the Incans relied really heavily on couriers, something like that.
Well, so they did orality, in other words. They made it work with orality, just as India did for a long time with orality, until writing got there, 600 BC, although the Harappan civilization that was there had writing. It's never been deciphered from 2600 BC down to the Indo-Aryan invasions by 1500 BC. So in the Vedic Aryans, when they come in there, they don't have writing. But the Harappans did. We have it. We have the script. We see the carvings, but nobody's been able to decipher them. So the Harappans had writing and the Vedic Aryans did not, which is one of the reasons why India is such a sound-based civilization. Not only do we have this prodigious feat of orality, but we also have a religion that's really based on mantras and humming. making mantric sounds, and they've got portable fire altars initially with the Vedic religion, because these people were nomads riding on horses who came in here. And so they brought nomadic fire altars for their worship, and they brought a religion based on vibration and sound, making chants and mantras and so forth. So in place of writing. So for a very long time, India was without writing for a very long time, down to 600 BC. That's the time of Hesiod, it's a century and a half after Homer. So
I need to back up for a second. So the Incans might be an example of a society that did not have writing, but still developed civilization. We don't know that, but it's possible. But is it also the case that given the degree to which India developed before it had writing, that it also would count as an example of civilization?
Perhaps. Yeah, maybe. That's a perhaps, with this caveat that when writing arrives in India in 600 BC, that's the period of its urbanization. That's when scholars, you'll read a history of India, and that's when they'll say, all of a sudden, all these cities start coming into being all over the place, and they shift in their architecture from building things in wood, none of which has survived, to building things in stone. And cities are springing up, all over the place. So there's a connection between writing and urbanization and the creation of cities. And it doesn't look like they had particularly developed cities prior to that, from that period of, let's say, 1200, 1300 BC, maybe 1500 down to 600. It is mostly an orally based society with not so much cities as just large villages. So yes, the civilization is up and running. It is true. They've got astronomy because we have the Rig Veda, when it finally, which is their oldest text, which dates from 1500 BC, but it was orally passed down. And we've just figured out its age based on philologists analyzing the language and so forth. It's got lots of astronomy in it, though. It's very clear that they had a sophisticated astronomical tradition, probably also mathematics. So yeah, India is, again, one of these puzzles that doesn't quite fit the paradigm that I'm putting forth here, where writing is essential, which I believe that it is. We've got it at the inception of Chinese civilization. It's there right from day one, with Mesopotamia, with Egypt, with Minoan Crete, which has not been deciphered, and the Mycenaeans, which has. So it's there in the inception of all of these, except for India, but the pre-Indian culture of Harappa had it, which is interesting. So yeah, these things are complex.
To the extent that writing is the fundamental innovation that distinguishes civilization from other kinds of societies, the question, why did writing develop? Was it an innovation whose time had come? And if it had not occurred in Sumer, it would have occurred somewhere else in roughly the same period? Those questions become important. So I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, I assume that you don't think that it was this Einsteinian once in 500 years insight, a flash of genius that may not have occurred for another 5,000 years if it hadn't occurred there, and then therefore would not have diffused to all these different places. I assume you think, again, it was an innovation whose time had come, and it probably would have happened somewhere else if it hadn't happened in Sumer in the not too distant future.
Well, that's a very complex question. We should probably save it for another time. I'll just end by briefly recounting this myth that comes from Sumer about the origins of writing there in the city of Uruk. They do have a myth for it, but this is a much later myth. Who knows whether it's true or not, about the king Enmerkar there, who's the grandfather of Gilgamesh, actually. So Enmerkar is fighting a war against the city of Aratta, which is not Sumerian. It's across the mountains to the east, the land where later the Elamites will emerge, and then eventually the Persians. And Enmerkar wants to go to war against the king of Aratta because Aratta has access to all these minerals and gems, and Sumer doesn't have that. They don't have metals and minerals there. It's a resource poor place, so all that metals and minerals has to be imported. So he wants to go to war, and so he keeps sending this runner back and forth, sending messages to the king of Aratta, and the runner is just getting exhausted over time, going back and forth, and he's getting more and more tired. And Enmerkar is giving him longer and longer things to say to the king of Aratta, and finally he gets to the king of Aratta and he can't remember the full message. And so he goes back to Enmerkar and tells him that. And Enmerkar says, well, let's do this then. Then he takes out a lump of clay and he invents writing. And he draws the first message on this. And he says, there you go. Now you'll remember it. And so the runner takes it to the king of Arata and says, all right, here's the message from the king. And he hands it to him. And the king of Arata looks at it. And of course, he can't read it. And so he looks at it under the firelight and it says his brow darkened. He can't read it. But the myth then says that Uruk becomes victorious over Arata because of the invention of writing, which makes them a superior people, more sophisticated, superior. He who has writing, the message of the myth is, will triumph over those who don't. So that says something about the rise of a civilized urban mentality, very closely connected with writing. And the Sumerians were very proud that they had invented writing, as this myth shows. You can recognize the barbarians. They're the ones who don't have writing.
So John, in our last conversation, the main thing I wanted to talk about was the unit that we call civilization, the unit that Spengler identifies 9 of and Toynbee identifies more than 20 of, or maybe more than 30 of. But just what exactly is this thing? What distinguishes a civilization from a society that isn't a civilization? What are the distinguishing characteristics? You went into a lot of detail about various things that distinguish civilized societies, with a particular emphasis on writing, I would say.
And then we came to the damn Inca, which was a monkey wrench in my theories. Remember that?
Yeah.
There's no evidence of writing with it. They're the only ones, though.
Maybe that will be useful, though, as we consider other ways of defining it. And maybe there is no single definition. Maybe it's an ideal type. There are like 6 or 7 things that are associated with it, and any civilization will have like 5 of them, but maybe not all of them, you know?
I think one of them, though, that's undeniable, and which the Inca share, is monumentality. The desire to produce very large structures, whether they're temples or, like the Nazca lines, or there's a sense where civilization brings in an epic approach to social formations that tribes don't have, and seems to be beyond their indigenous peoples, tribal peoples. It seems to be beyond their imaginative horizon. They do things on small scales. The Eskimo carve little ivory walruses and bears and figurines. The Paleolithic tribes painted art on caves, but everything is small scale, and something to do with what we mean by civilization involves, I think, an epic imagination. And it's not an accident that epics as a literary genre are defined by that too, by monumentality. Large, they're long, they feature huge battles in almost every one. You almost can't even have an epic without some huge Mahabharata type or Trojan War battle going on. So the epic itself, which is the earliest literary form, seems to be the literary transformation of that monumentality that's beholden to it. So anyhow, I just thought I'd throw that out to chew on.
At what stage of civilization, using Spengler's stages, does monumentality come in?
Well, it's always there at the beginning with the Egyptian pyramids, and then of course, with the Greeks, it was all wooden. We've lost all of that. But in the pre-cultural phase, we do have Mycenaean architecture, which is so large and full of Stonehenge-like liths that they're apparently moving around with ease, that the Greeks of Homer's generation thought that it must have been built by the Cyclops, the Mycenaeans, because their temples are so huge, fortresses rather, are so huge, and they used huge blocks. So already there's a tendency toward monumentality with the Greeks in the pre-culture phase. With the Egyptians, it's the early culture phase. Yeah.
I mean, the reason I pressed on that is because I was thinking of Greco-Roman or classical civilization, and I think of the monumental structures as coming in the civilization phase, the Roman phase. But it's interesting, you're noting
super large ones. Yeah, the absurdly large ones do come in at the tail end. Yeah. The Greeks and the Hindus are problematic, as I think we said before, because their early monuments are wood, and those are all gone. So we don't really know for certain. Once you get to the early culture phase of both, they're both descended from similar peoples in Indo-European peoples who were nomads and were used to small scale culture because they were nomadic. So there is that aspect to them that's different from the Egyptians, where they're often running with huge pyramids, and also with the Sumerians, they're often running with very large temple complexes that later on become the giant ziggurats. That corresponds to their Colosseum phase, though it's late. But we've lost, because because they built with mud brick, we've lost a lot of their temples, the early ones, the early culture ones. And so we require the imagination of archaeologists to come in, map out the ground plan, and then imagine what it looked like. So all we really have are diagrams that show, though, that like the great temple to On, the sky god On at Uruk, was monumental. It was very, very large, even though we've lost all the mud brick structure there. There does appear to be, in cathedrals in our case, right? Those are right there at the beginning, whether you're saying Romanesque or Gothic, either one, they're still, especially Gothic is monumental.
That's a great observation. I wasn't even thinking about far Western, or not far Western, Faustian, to use Spengler's term. That's actually a great example because, as you say, 12th century, right?
That's
all
it.
over France. That's really interesting. Now, and obviously with the Mayans, you have the pyramids. So that's another.
Yeah, they're building pyramidal structures very early. Yeah.
What about the Incas? Are they a problem here too?
I'm not 100% sure about their springtime phase. I do know that they do produce like Machu Picchu, but I think that's later on. I can't think of a single example where we've got a tribal society building monumental structures. The closest might be Göbekli Tepe, which was unearthed, I don't know, 15 years ago. It's relatively recent in Turkey, Eastern Turkey, which nobody thought that because this is 10,000 BC and it's right on the threshold of the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, that, and it's, so far as we know now, the oldest megalithic culture, and they were building in a monumental style, and these must have been tribal peoples. They're still not, they're just barely settling in villages at this point. And it surprised archaeologists because I don't think anybody thought that they were capable of that kind of group planning and collective thinking that such structures require. They're not huge. They're not like the pyramids or the cathedrals. They're probably grave temples. They're circles of monoliths with connecting walls, like circles within circles at the top of a hill. So already you have the ascent mentality. We have to go to the top of the hill to find the sacred structure that eventually does lead to the pyramids and the ziggurats. It's not really monumental in the sense that I'm using the word, though, where it's big scale thinking. And megalithic societies can build, who are sort of in a way midway between tribal societies and the high civilizations. Like if we think of Newgrange in Ireland, which is very, very large, pretty much monumental, actually. And so now here's another damn thing that interrupts my theory, because I'd forgotten about Newgrange and structures like it, which date back to about 3500 BC. Right at the same time that Sumer is getting up and running. And we get all these coastal, through Europe, on the coasts of Ireland and Europe and Spain, on into the Mediterranean, all these megalithic complexes that are already indicating a tendency from 3500 down to Stonehenge, which is kind of at the end of it, at 1200 BC. The megalith culture is pretty monumental. And it does lead to Mycenae. Actually, Mycenae comes out of it. If you look at the architecture of Mycenae, they're using the same mentality as the builders of Stonehenge, with the two blocks and one going across it to stabilize it. And then you fill it in, or not in the case of Stonehenge. In the case of Mycenae, they fill in the gaps. So I don't know. Yeah, monumentality does seem to be
a pretty good one.
Though you can adduce examples of monumentality without high civilization, I don't think the converse is true. I don't think you can adduce examples of high civilization without monumentality. So that would be my way of snaking out of this quandary.
No, you can.
I sometimes find myself in these back alleys.
Anytime you can identify a necessary condition, even if it's not sufficient, you're working your way toward a strong definition. And of course, I know that you've argued in previous conversations that you attribute the rise of high civilization to a transformation in religious consciousness, wherein
that too,
society begins to feel that it has to build these monumental structures in order to justify its existence to deities or something like that.
Yeah, correct? Because you don't have the architecture without the religious beliefs first.
Right.
So the religious beliefs have to come into being first, and people have to sort of, they're already having their rituals celebrating this religious view, whatever it is, and then it occurs to somebody, we need to build a great temple to come that sort of normalizes and naturalizes our religious view and sanctifies it and gives it legitimacy and validity. We have the temples, the barbarians on the other side of the hill don't. That's what makes us human and them not. It's that kind of a thing. It's almost an identity marker for these societies, I think. It even scales down to small things like the Egyptians, who were bald-headed and clean-shaven, and they would attach a ceremonial beard, like a goat's beard that goes down, and then put wigs on. They regarded the shaggy barbarians as, these are people who don't shave. They're not civilized. They have hair, all this facial hair. So these societies do have these little signifiers that go all the way from the pyramids all the way down to how you shave, that identifies you as Egyptian and makes you be able to make the claim that you're legitimately human, they're barbarians.
So I think we already talked about this a little bit, but Toynbee has this definition of civilization, if I remember correctly. Like, he goes through all of these different potential criteria that might distinguish civilized societies from non-civilized societies, knocks down all of them, and then settles upon something like the claim that what distinguishes civilized society is dynamism, as distinct from stasis. It's a kind of movement towards something, an aspirational movement, versus non-civilized societies just stay the same. They just rinse and repeat generation after generation.
The mimesis is backward toward the dead and the ancestors, right. Whereas the mimesis with high civilization is toward living individuals, the creative minority, who is doing really interesting things with their artists and poets that everyone else wants to be them. It's like us with our movie stars. We don't have that anymore because we don't have a creative minority anymore leading the civilization. But in pop culture, its equivalent would be everybody wants to be James Dean or Elvis Presley or Marilyn Monroe. The mimesis it's that kind of thing.
We've listed some of the more kind of objective features, or like the exoskeleton of civilization. It's got to have advanced mathematics and astronomy. It has to have writing, or almost always has writing, has to have monumentality. Is your view that once a society is dynamic and is following a creative minority, it will develop those things? Is that the basic story? It will develop.
Yeah. It's all those things are part of that mimesis that's being created by the creative minority, which more or less has a monopoly on geniuses. For the culture, architectural geniuses, we have Imhotep, the earliest great architect that we know of, who designed the third dynasty, the first great pyramid. It's a stepped pyramid, but it's the first one. And those kinds of individuals that the creative minority has a monopoly on, that other people wish they could be. I just finished reading a biography of Goethe and read it the whole time with envy. I was like, yeah, why did this guy get to be Goethe and not me? And that's what it is. It's that there's a kind of an envy there where people want to do what Goethe did, let's say. Not anymore. They want to be basketball players and movie stars. But in the origins of civilization, it's an elite who are individuals who are really good at something that's hard to get good at. So it's something that the average person doesn't want to spend time on. In many cases, because they can't, since they're so involved in the economics of, hiking 2 miles to the well to get water and raising the goats and sheep. But, all their energy is drained from the daily economics of living. So there's nothing left over for them. And people like, let's say, Goethe or Schopenhauer, they're just two examples, didn't really have to work a day in their life. So they just inherited all this wealth. Schopenhauer inherited his father's business, never had to work. Goethe was privileged because of being appointed privy councillor in Weimar by the Duke Karl August. Everything was laid out for them, so they didn't have to worry about it. So they had all this time left over to develop intellect and apply it to all these higher civilizational pursuits. So in a certain sense, these individuals in the springtime also must be in similar situations, but they don't have to worry about expending all their mental energy on just surviving. They can be cared for by the creative elite, as, let's say, Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael could depend on the church for all these commissions, is to establish their basic livelihood. So they can spend all their time doing all this. That will further civilization. A Sistine Chapel gives, all this prestige that comes along with, here's what we can achieve. What can you guys achieve? So there's a lot of pride bound up with it and prestige. And then along comes the Dutch, who, because of the Protestant outbreak in the 17th century, by the time the wars are over, the Protestant Catholic wars are over with the Treaty of Westphalia, they're the first who have to have day jobs, because now all these Dutch painters and artists, they don't have the church, to pay their bills. So now for the first time in art history comes the concept of the day job. All of these guys had different day jobs, working as burgers, and either they might have owned a restaurant or a tavern, or worked as a lens grinder like Spinoza did, whatever it is, to where then it reduces the amount of energy that you have left to create, but you still do the creating at night and on the weekends, let's say, as we would put it, as people have tried to do. And I always discourage individuals, especially the young guys that come to me, the 20-year-olds, from taking day jobs. Don't do it, because you won't have any energy left for your creative works, as I experienced from having day jobs. I had a few of them, not that many, but I did have a few, and I was way too exhausted to do anything. So I had to figure out how to get rid of the day job and just figure out how to survive no matter how. And to do that, you have to take morality and put it over here. Morality it's not gonna pay your rent. It's not gonna pay your bills. So I lived with my mother for 8 years in her house, rent free. And after my divorce, and during those 8 years, I produced 20 books. So, and I've heard some people say, oh, I would never live off my parents. You're never gonna write 20 books with that mentality. It's not gonna happen, because you've allowed morality to interfere with your creative energy. It's not a moral thing, it's amoral. Creativity is as amoral as sex is, totally amoral. You put judgments on it all you want, but the energy is there. And if you jam it up, it's going to cause you all kinds of psychological problems, both somatic and psychological. You have to find a way as a young man to get rid of the morality, get rid of the day job, and find a way, even if you have to live on welfare. Fine, Nietzsche did. Nietzsche and Spengler both lived on welfare from the state. Judge them how you will. Without that welfare, we wouldn't have Decline of the West. We wouldn't have Nietzsche's Earth. So, you got to find a way. And these kinds of guys are guys who I think they find a way. They always find a way. The ones who don't fall by the wayside. There's a kind of cultural selection that's like natural selection that just weeds them out. They didn't have the stuff, what Thomas Wolfe calls the right stuff. Tom Wolfe calls the right stuff. You got to have the right stuff.
Maybe find a day job where you just have to sit at a desk and you can do whatever you want. Maybe that would be the way of combining. Right.
And here's two classic examples that I think make that problematic. Kafka had a day job, and you can collect all of Kafka's writings in 2 volumes, 2 small, all 3 of the unfinished novels, and a handful of short stories. That's the result of a day job. Same thing with T.S. Eliot, who had a day job working in a bank. You can collect all of Eliot's writings in 1 slender volume. That's what happens with a day job. Fine, do it. Maybe you can make a dent, but it's not going to be Goethe, and it's not going to be Nietzsche or Spengler. I mean, it's not going to be Leonardo. You've got to find a way. I don't think the day job is much of a solution.
So if imitation of a creative minority is the engine of dynamism, how would you connect that, if at all, to Quigley's notion of an instrument of expansion? Because he calls the engine that drives civilization forward the instrument of expansion. For Toynbee, it's imitation of the creative minority.
Response. Challenge and response also, which I think maybe he changed his mind, because challenge and response was in the early version of the study of history as the mechanism that brought these civilizations into being, because they all emerge out of a physical landscape, or at least the first generation, out of a physical landscape that's difficult to manage. The Egyptians have to drain the swamps in the Delta Valley. The Sumerians have to solve the problem of water scarcity on the alluvial plain, which they solve with irrigation by inventing it, which is where it was invented. And then with the second generation, it changes to a response to social challenges that are inherited because as these dying behemoths of the first generation are disintegrating. But then the version of a study of history that I did the chapter by chapter Google Play of was all the way at the end of Toynbee's career, where that's where he talks about mimesis versus mimesis of living people versus the dead. So he might have changed his mind a bit. The challenge and response theory is still there in that late edition. And maybe they're not, mutually contradictory. He doesn't seem to think that they are. But
Well, yeah, I
yeah,
mean, the challenge gives rise to a response by a creative minority who then becomes the
right,
subject of mimesis.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so
By the way, I don't know if I told you this, but it was very hard. Well, not very hard, but it was somewhat difficult for me to track down that edition, that single volume edition of Toynbee with illustrations. But I did, and I had to drive an hour to get it. But it's one of my most prized possessions.
I love that book. Yeah, and I love the
Yeah.
illustrations. I remember when I was in my 20s and it was in Barnes and Noble as a featured book. You could walk up to a display featuring it and the pages were open and you could flip through it. And it was like this numinous mystery. It was like, oh, I can't wait to read this.
You emphasize, and you and I have emphasized in our conversations, the differences between Toynbee and Spengler. But one thing that really hit me when I read the single volume study of history by Toynbee is how deeply influenced by Spengler he is. In fact,
you can never quite get away from him. He wants to disavow him.
Yeah.
But it never quite is convincing.
Well, I think Toynbee is almost too Spenglerian for a lot of Anglo-American historians, right? Because he does take mythology very seriously. And actually even in articulating his challenge and response theory, he draws from various mythological traditions that basically have a kind of challenge and response story within them in order to illustrate his theory of how civilizations come into being, which would never be done in a work of academic history in the English-speaking academy. So,
and it's interesting, and it's worth mentioning too as a footnote that he takes this challenge and response theory from Goethe's Faust, where he has Goethe has this prologue in heaven before the epic begins, where Mephistopheles is just hanging around the court of God, and God says, "What? So what have you been up to?" And he's like, "Oh, I've been hither and yon, just goofing off. Why?" And then God says, "Have you considered Faust?" The same thing with Job in the book of Job. It's modeled on the book of Job. He says, have you considered Faust? And Mephistopheles is like, "Oh, you mean Dr. Faust? Yeah, I know who he is." And he says, "Well, maybe you should consider this temptation. See if you can lead him astray. And if you can lead him astray from the right path, then you can have his soul." So it's a wager, but it is a challenge and a response. Faust has to respond to this challenge that Mephistopheles then brings to him from God. And so Toynbee borrows that, he says, in a study of history, and says, "This is where I got the idea from a great play, a great work of art." It wasn't taken from economics or geological or environmental history. It was taken from Faust. So that in itself is, it's an act of imagination that most historians would frown on, I think, because it's not grounded in history.
Right. A little too woo-woo.
So you find a lot of that in Toynbee, that kind of thinking.
And I guess maybe the way we might link instrument of expansion to imitation of the creative minority is that the creative minority basically creates or leads the instrument of expansion, right? So I'm sure there were elites driving feudalism forward and others followed. Certainly there were elites driving capitalism forward and others followed. So Quigley's instrument of expansion is maybe like what the creative minority is doing at any particular stage in a civilization's history to drive society forward, and that others are following, right?
There is no instrument of expansion without that creative minority.
Right.
So he almost presupposes it, because it is only, the aristocracy and the artists who are pushing it forward. It's coming from, it's analogous to the fact, and when I was teaching a class once a long time ago on Jungian psychology, some guy raised his hand and he said, "Why is it that in all these plays and stories that we look at, the main character is always some prince or king or somebody from royalty, all the way down to maybe the middle of the 18th century with Lessing in Germany, who starts bringing the burghers on stage for the first time. So why is that?" And I said, "Well, because that's who everyone wanted to be. Those were the movie stars. Hamlet is a prince for a reason. That's because he wouldn't be legitimate in Shakespearean society if he wasn't connected with royalty. All of Shakespeare's characters are royalty because that's who everyone wanted to be. Those were the movie stars." And so it's a similar thing to that. So the instrument of expansion, of course, is naturally going to come from a creative minority that's connected with the aristocracy one way or another.
The flip side of this is these static non-civilization societies. Can you say a little bit, either in theory or with respect to particular cases, about stasis? That is, I've heard it said that, hunter-gatherer bands and tribes can just go untold numbers of generations completely unchanged.
The Kalahari Bushmen, the Eskimos, classic examples.
We've already talked about this in a sense, but what takes a society out of that pattern?
Part of it is this relationship to an environment that's too challenging to master. With the Eskimos, forget it. All you can do is hunt seals. That's it, and make little walrus ivory carvings and build igloos. You can't do monumentality there. There's no writing. There's no mathematics. The mimesis then remains to the dead ancestors, or the shamans, or whoever. Same thing with the Kalahari Bushmen. They can't. There's no way to master that desert environment. It's too brutal. And with the Polynesians as well, which was one of Toynbee's early examples in the first version of A Study of History, and I think he eliminated this in the later one, of arrested civilizations, that he said the Polynesians got stuck in a state of stasis because they created what this term that Toynbee uses as a tour de force, but he means it in a specific way, which is that a society uses up all available energy to conquer their environment, the Polynesians mastering the Pacific, to the point where they have nothing left to really advance beyond that. Plus, the environment is resistant to any further advance. So it's kind of a combination of the environment plus, which kind of forces these peoples to remain in an ancestor mimetic mode. Ancestor worship is another word for it. Ancestor mimetic is better, though. It's more precise.
Well, and I think nomads are another example he cites of a tour de force, basically arresting.
To be fair, though, he does say this about one high civilization, the Byzantine civilization, which he said under Justinian exhausted itself by reconquering the Mediterranean because it was important to them that they were the successor to the Roman Empire. It was very important that they owned the same amount of land, which they did, not quite, but close, very close. And then they had exhausted all their energies in that tour de force to the point where Byzantium never really evolved much culturally past that. So that's another example that he gives of a high civilization ending up with stasis. And this may be the reason, then this may be his indirect reason of explaining why the Ottomans did conquer them, in 1453. They just gobbled them up because they had so weakened themselves metaphysically through that tour de force. They really didn't have enough energy to resist the Ottomans. I think that's his implication.
Yeah, like the rare example of a universal state coming from an alien civilization.
Mm-hmm. Right. Then we have a few of those, like the British Raj with India, and the Muslims there who were there with a universal state before that. Sometimes the universal state will be conferred by an alien civilization. There are a few examples of that. Yeah, the Ottoman Empire is another one, vis-a-vis Byzantium.
And was I correct that he also, just returning to the nomads of the Eurasian steppe, that he also regards the difficulty of mastering that geography?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sufficiently difficult.
Really do much. With the Siberian steppe, there's not a whole lot of give from the environment. There has to be the possibility that if a group of people exerts this much energy, that there is enough give from the environment that it will result in a significant transformation of the environmental landscape, as was the case with the Sumerian invention of irrigation. They figured out that they're in the dry farming zone, which is far enough south to where you don't have enough natural rain to handle crops, as they do in the privileged north. And so because the north, meaning Syria and regions to the north that get enough rainfall, they have cedar forests and so forth, they're sort of spoiled. So they're not going to originate civilization for that very reason. They can just rely. It's like a child growing up depending on its parents, and the kid never moves out of mom's basement. Okay, the kid's never going to achieve anything.
Right.
Just constantly relying on the bounty of nature, the bounty of the parents, the bounty of the mother. So because of that fact that they could no longer rely on, let's say, the plump mother goddess, they had to shift to the father gods and their strength, invent artificial rain by creating canals so that they could harness these two very dangerous rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, to bring these rivers down, these artificial rivers down to the lower resource poor alluvial plain between them. Then once they got control of that, And you'll notice too that their goddess figurines are slender Playboy style figurines. Now we get for the first time the goddess is not the all providing bounteous northern goddess that extends from the Paleolithic to the Taurus Mountains, but is slender. That's a telling fact. Plus, not only that, Inanna, which is probably their oldest goddess, never brings forth children. She's just the patron saint of prostitutes and whores. She never brings forth children. So interesting in the change of the role of the goddess in the society, the rise of the plow, which has to be managed by strong men, irrigation, all of that conspires then to bring forth the world's first civilization, which we're still living within their shadow. I mean, right. We're living within the shadow of World War II, but even on a bigger scale, we're still living within the shadow of the achievements of the Sumerians. They created the whole idea of civilization. That's where it comes from.
Right. And like the next thing might be a sort of global, that might be the next step. But Western civilization is just another example of a kind of, in a sense, parochial civilization, just like Mesopotamian. Or
we're all descendants of History Begins at Sumer. That's the title of one of Samuel Noah Kramer's famous books. History Begins at Sumer. It remains the case. And it's still a great book.
I'm getting to the point where I strongly prefer to read things that were written 75 or more years ago.
Notice too, like, when people ask me, what history of Egypt should I read? And I always tell them James Henry Breasted's History of Egypt, which was written, I think, in the 1920s, if I'm right. So there's lots more archaeology that's come in since then, but not a better book, man. That thing is a masterpiece. And the difference that you'll note is that in the standards for writing style for a mastery of the language were different in that time. So these books are not just sources of information like modern academics books are, they're also aesthetically pleasing. They read like novels. There's a sense that these guys are writing, they want to create an epic and they want to be worthy of the English language and master it. Totally different sets of standards. So that I totally agree with you on that.
And obviously they reflect some of the biases and ideologies of their time, but probably
you're smart enough to filter that out. I mean, it's just be smart enough to filter out the biases.
Well, and honestly, I mean, I think a lot of the biases and ideologies were not as dumb as some of the more recent ones that taint contemporary scholarship. You have to pay lip service to all kinds of ideas and emphases when you write history now. Otherwise, it's not going to be published, at least in a prestigious press. So there's so much you can learn by reading old history because they were not constrained by the norms of political correctness that now constrain scholars. But
the older books are better. I think that's correct. They are better. Spengler wrote, he was working when he died on a sequel to Decline of the West called Frühzeit der Weltgeschichte, the dawn of world history, whereas Decline of the West was about the Untergang, the twilight. And he was going to go back and look at history starting with the Paleolithic. And he changes his metaphors when he gets into these earlier societies, what Toynbee would call them as societies, from the plant, which is vertical, rooted, axial. It grows axially, and it seems to work very well. Deleuze and Guattari might dismiss this as what they call an arborescent model, because it's vertical and it's based on a tree metaphor, as so many of our thought systems in the West during the metaphysical age have been based on tree metaphors, actually. So what he does is he looks at three, what he calls cultural amoebae. So now the metaphor shifts to an amoeba, because an amoeba is a much more flexible organism. It can sort of drift around, throw out pseudopodia. It's not quite, it's no longer really vertical, it's horizontal in its orientation. And so he has these three cultural amoebae that constitute the Neolithic. He treats the Paleolithic with a different metaphor, mineralogical metaphors, actually. But these amoebae are interesting because they're not civilizations, and they account for, so the first one he calls Atlantean, not referring to the myth of Atlantis, but just that it comes in off the coasts of Europe, North Africa, and comes across down sort of into the Middle East. So it's a very broad geographical sweep, and it's flexible. And these amoebae can last for thousands of years. And then he's got another amoeba coming in from India. And so it extends across from India and it moves from east to west, also down into the Middle East. So there's these two amoebae. And he has this theory that the first, what Toynbee would call the first generation of civilization, comes into being precisely where they meet and cross, namely in Egypt and the Middle East. So the one amoeba is the priestly one, where coming across from India, the emphasis is on priests and on the building of large megalithic temple monuments. So he brings that in. And then the other one is a kind of warrior mentality that comes across from these hunters and warrior men with spears and so forth coming across North Africa. And the two join and we get high civilization. And with high civilization, we get a good model from India with the idea of 4 separate and distinct castes, where you have the Kshatriya caste, which is the warrior caste, and they are opposed to the Brahmin caste. Those are the priests. They handle all the rites and the rituals. The Kshatriya caste really can't do anything unless the priests say they can. Maybe they look at the stars or whatever it is they do, or consult tradition. The Brahmin caste is revered as the highest in India, proper to a priestly civilization. In Greece, it's of course the warrior caste. So you have these two castes, and then you have the middle caste of the Vaishya, which are the burghers, the merchants, the average everyday people, and then the low class, the Shudra. These are the workers. Basically, this would be Marx's distinction between the proletariat and the owners of the machines of production. So you have 4 distinct separate castes, which are hierarchical in their orientation. The Kshatriya and the Brahmins are at the top, Vaishya in the middle, and the Shudra at the bottom. And it's analogized to a giant, with the Shudra as the feet and the Vaishya as the middle section, and then of course the 2 arms as the 2 top castes. So when high civilization comes into being, there is this vertical orientation and differentiation between these different castes. You have to have those castes, socially speaking, in addition to what we mentioned before about monumental architecture coming in, which you really generally don't have in the pre-civilizational societies, the cultural amoebae. Then, of course, there's one that comes down from the north, which Spangler calls Turan. Those are the Indo-Aryans, the Indo-Europeans. They come later during the 2nd millennium, 2000 BC to 1000, and would correspond neatly to Toynbee's 2nd generation of civilization, which comes in as the result of that amoeba, which is a huge flexible range going across, from Europe all the way across the Black Sea region, the Caucasus Mountains, a very broad range in the Hindu Kush, and then they come down. And so there's a 3rd amoeba that comes in. So these amoebae are very flexible. They cover vast geographical territories. They're generally on the move. They're generally nomadic. They don't have time to stop, sit, think mathematically and build buildings. They don't generally do that. And so that's one of the main criteria for the distinction, I think. It's worth thinking about.
Yeah, so when I was thinking about how what you said so far fits into these different boxes, I thought a lot of what we talked about so far has to do with the vertical and the exterior. That is what distinguishes a civilized society from a pre-civilized society viewed from the exterior. And you talked about McLuhan, the transition from orality to writing. That's a very important way of distinguishing civilized from pre-civilized society. I mean, if you're just trying to be very simple about it, how do we know if a society is civilized or not? Well, does it function through the medium of writing or through the medium of oral traditions? You also talked about monumental structures. So does the society build monumental structures or does it not? You also mentioned, does the society have math and astronomy or does it not? And one thing that I think you've said here that is new is the society differentiated with respect to class, or is there a kind of class hierarchy? Is there inequality? I don't think we had talked about that before, but would you say, I think I have heard this, that is another characteristic feature of civilization that distinguishes it from pre-civilized society?
Yes, exactly. It is interesting that Deleuze and Guattari do mention that when they're talking about tribal societies, what they call the pre-signifying sign regime, they're talking about tribal societies. They have this interesting idea number one, that they're rhizomatic, they're horizontal, but that they deliberately have kinship structures in place to ward off the formation of a state. And so they reject this evolutionary model that eventually, you know, primitive societies are on the way, eventually they'll become high civilizations. Well, he says, no, it's not the case, because they have all these social structures in place specifically to ward off that kind of vertical orientation, that the formation of the state as a kind of arborescent model, which is interesting to consider. I'm not 100% sure that they're right. But another thing does have to do with the mobility, the geographical movement, and Thompson's idea of the first generation being tied to rivers. I think that's part of it too, because you have to have a reliable water source that with the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Nile, and then in India with the Indus Valley, you have reliable river sources that tend to root people in one spot. Oh, we have access to all this water, you know, that's from the north that comes down. In Egypt, it comes up from the south, but it's reliable. And so why go wandering from there if you have a reliable water source? We have everything we need right here. Let's stay here. So there's a tendency then to build villages and lock into place. There's plenty of time for thought and building of larger and larger and larger structures. And we do see, as you look at Mesopotamian architecture as it evolves through the Neolithic into the high civilization period of the Bronze Age, 3500 BC, that they start with small temples that grow larger and larger and larger over time. So there's the riverine nature of this first generation, I think, is very important, whereas the amoeba cultures are nomadic, they're wandering around, they can go from place to place. They're not locked into these riverine situations. I think that may have something to do with it as well. With the Greeks, of course, though, as Thompson points out, the model shifts to an oceanic model where the Greeks, they have bad land for agriculture. They can't grow much there other than olives and wine, grapes. So they can export all of that, olive oil, and build an economy on exportation, as long as they have those mobile, you know, they have to cut down all their wood and have the ships to make it mobile for export and transportation. So it becomes based on the ocean rather than on rivers. But that's the second generation. So it's a different deal there.
A little bit later, we can talk about how obviously one exterior difference between civilizations is the ecology, right? Going back to Thompson, but some develop on rivers like the first generation, others do not. They develop mainly because of proximity to an ocean. And that's really the
Minoan Crete,
according to Thompson. Right. Yeah. And that also has a chronological element, obviously. But do you think that it would be fair to say then from an exterior point of view, if we're trying to understand the vertical criteria of civilization, the things we would look for from an exterior point of view would be writing as distinct from orality.
Yes.
Math and astronomy versus the absence of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Monumentality, cathedrals, ziggurats, etc., versus no such things. Societal differentiation and hierarchy, castes or classes of priests, warriors, owners, workers, versus a much more egalitarian social structure. Yeah. I mean, I think in pre-civilized societies, you have functional differentiation. You have a shaman, but it's not, I'm not sure if you would say that's hierarchical. Maybe it is.
Not really.
Yeah.
Because remember, he's always in trouble. So
yeah, right.
You know, he's revered, but he's got to keep well away from the tribe with his own little hut, you know.
One thing we haven't really talked about is just size, right? Because societal differentiation and hierarchy, and also the existence of a state, which you mentioned and which I want to come back to, those both imply scale, right? Whereas the pre-civilized societies, they're simply smaller. We're talking about smaller groups of people. You mentioned earlier, Deleuze and Guattari say that pre-civilized societies emphasize kinship structures in a way that resists the formation of a state.
Yeah.
Two things. First, what do they mean by state? And second, you said that you're not sure if they're right about that. Could you elaborate a little bit? Because I'm thinking maybe one other exterior feature of civilization versus pre-civilized societies would be the existence of a state.
Well, yeah, but I mean, they're wrong insofar as at some point, these pre-civilized societies do evolve into high civilization. Where else did they come from? So those are exceptions maybe to what they might be talking about as a rule, maybe the certain clans in Polynesia and New Guinea, they never formed a state. The Eskimo, the Kung Bushmen in South Africa, these are societies that have lasted for an untold amount of time. Who knows how far they go back? They've never formed states. So they may be right in that respect, but with respect to Egypt and Mesopotamia, we have to have recourse to a developmental model. There's no other way to account for the rise of these vertical structures, which I would emphasize are intensive rather than extensive, whereas you can think of the Indo-European amoeba as an extensive, amoeba, if you want to think of it as a living organism, sort of. It's extensive, and at some point, the concentration in one spot geographically allows and maybe even forces for growth that, because it can't go horizontally, let's say, it has nowhere else to go but up, like New York City. You're on Manhattan Island there, you've got no place else to develop but vertically. So it kind of puts a pressure on the place to develop vertically. It's not like the Southwest where you can, where it's totally horizontal because there's nothing but land available. So in a certain sense, it forces intensivity, and that pressure, it might even be a kind of metaphysical pressure on the consciousness of the elite, the creative elite, to start growing in terms of the skyscraper type buildings, the ziggurats and the pyramids, to start building vertically. And so that may have something to do with it. Whereas later, then, of course, in the end phases, then it trades out intensivity for imperial extensivity once it starts building universal states, which all these civilizations also do. But that's later in the end phase, when they're exhausting resources and they realize they've got to go steal land from someone else to bring in, imports. So there may be a process that moves from extensive tribal societies to intensive civilization to extensive universal states, perhaps.
This is fascinating. I never thought about the fact that localization and intensivity will cause the creative elite to build upward, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Whereas if you're on the Eurasian land ocean, the steppe, right? Yeah. You just expand outward in every direction.
Yeah, nothing but space. There's no real pressure on those peoples to this day. It's populated by steppe nomads, that whole zone there. It's still going. And they build the steppe nomads, the Eurasian steppe nomads today, they build tents, yurts, pack them up and load them onto their pack animals and go. They still live exactly the same way as the Indo-Europeans did.
So going back to the state for a second, I view the state as a political category. How would you define it? If we are going to say that a state is a characteristic exterior feature of civilized versus pre-civilized societies, what exactly are we talking about when we say state?
When we say a state, we're usually talking about taxes, I'm afraid. As Toulouse-Guattari says, the state, you are infinitely indebted to the state. You can never pay it off. That's what taxation is. And early taxation is corvée, where in Mesopotamia, the taxation is that you can be called upon to do labor, to dig canals, irrigation ditches at any given time, and you have to pay that. If you can't afford, let's say silver, whatever their equivalent, I believe it was silver actually that they were trading. And if you don't have that, then you have to pay the state in labor. And so the state is constantly extracting, flows, monetary flows from you constantly. So that's part of it, because it's powered by a priesthood always, whether we're talking about Mesopotamian priests running ziggurats all the way down to the Catholic Church. There's always a priesthood that needs money to build those temples because the gods desire that. And if they demand it, then that puts pressure on the priests to demand from the population constant flows to the temple. And so we do see works of Sumerian art showing lines going up step layer by layer, as though going up a ziggurat carrying goats, rams, and pots of fruit and figs and so forth that they're going to give to the priests when they get to the top. So taxation is right there from the start. That's one of the earliest works of Sumerian art, the Worka vessel, I believe it's called. It goes back right to 3200 BC. So it's already there in place. That whole state hierarchical structure with a political ruler and a priest. Sometimes in Mesopotamia, they were the same, one and the same. Sometimes they were separate. So that has to have something to do with it, the corvée, the taxation, the economic extraction from the population in order to finance large, ambitious projects, monumental projects. Otherwise, the gods will punish your city with plague and conquest and famine, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Yeah.
And there we're getting to the interior, but staying on the exterior.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. This is really helpful.
I don't always make those Ken Wilberian distinctions.
Well, when we get to the interior, I'm sure we'll see how it relates to the exterior, but I'm keeping them separate mainly because it helps me. It helps me make sense of things, but of course they're not separate. There's only one reality. Right. Okay, so this is helpful. And actually the way you're defining state, it's very similar to the way I've defined it in the classroom, which is the fundamental task of any state is revenue extraction. And that can either be through taxing the population or maybe monopolizing access to a certain valuable resource, right? And then reaping the rents from that. So you think of like Saudi Arabia.
Troops, they have to have troops to defend the state against being.
Well, I was going to say the fundamental thing is taxation or some revenue source. And then the question is, what are you using those things for? Now, you said just now, and this is helpful because it helps relate the exterior features to each other. Well, one thing you need the resources for, whether it's money or labor, is to build the monumental structures that are a characteristic exterior feature of civilization. But of course, also, when we think about the basic state functions, it is the coercive apparatus that maintains order within the territory and then prevents invasion externally, correct?
Exactly right. There's got to be some immune system in place that keeps the space within from being engulfed by others with different ethnicities and different religious ideas and values that if they gobble you up will overcode your system, just as we did, let's say the Spaniards with the Incas and the Aztecs. We overcoded them with Christianity. They lost their identity and now they're gone.
Yeah, and one thing I want to come back to a little bit later is that Francis Fukuyama, in his most recent two-volume book about the origins of political order and political decay, he's very influenced by Toynbee and Huntington, I think. But he argues that the first civilization to create what he calls a modern state, which by that I think he means a meritocratic, impersonal state that delivers services and performs its functions effectively across the entire national territory, where bureaucrats and functionaries are competent. They rise to their levels through civil service exams rather than through cronyism or patronage. He says that the first civilization to create such a state is Chinese civilization. And then I think the second civilization that created such a state, in his view, and here he's drawing on the work of Charles Tilly, is basically Western civilization. So I think if Fukuyama is right, while having a state is a vertical criterion of civilization from an exterior point of view, maybe the degree of professionalization of the state varies from one civilization to another. I think at least Fukuyama would say that. Okay, so just kind of bringing all of the exterior vertical together, writing rather than orality, math and astronomy versus not, monumental structures versus not, large population versus small bands or small tribes, inequality within that large population, a caste system or a class system that distinguishes between priests and warriors and owners and workers, a state that taxes this population in order to finance monumental structures and maintain order within the territory and protect from external invasion. Now, obviously, there's going to be some kind of uniting idea or symbol, some philosophy or religion that holds this large population together. We don't need to be too specific about that, but some combination of language and values is going to be holding these people together, although obviously civilizations can encompass very disparate peoples. I think one thing that we've talked a bit about, which I think merits mention in this context, again, if we're thinking about the exterior features of civilized versus pre-civilized, well, one exterior feature of civilized versus pre-civilized societies is immobility, a sense of permanence, a sense of rootedness in a particular territory that you then engage in intensively. So all of the action is intensive, as you say, It's concentrated in a particular territory that people are rooted in, settled in. And that manifests perhaps as building vertically rather than extending spatially. Lots of people concentrated, settled, and intensively engaged. Do you think there's anything big that we're leaving out? Again, what we're trying to do in this section of this conversation is basically name the things that we would be looking for from an exterior point of view if we wanted to distinguish civilized from pre-civilized societies. Do you think we've hit the big ones?
I think so, as far as the exoskeleton goes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move to the endoskeleton. So, okay, so one thing that you and I have already talked about that I think now fits in the vertical interior. So now we're thinking of what distinguishes a civilized from a pre-civilized society when we're thinking about the subjectivity of the people involved, how the people involved actually think, their consciousness, how they feel, et cetera. One thing that we've talked about in this connection is that in civilized societies, people imitate a living creative minority rather than their ancestors. And according to, I think you, but also to Toynbee, this drives the dynamism of civilization. It allows innovation and dynamism rather than, stasis and stagnation. So that would be one interior difference, imitating a creative minority rather than worshiping, revering, and imitating the dead. Because I think, as you put it, the dead always say no to new technologies and innovations. They want to keep things as they have always been. One other thing that I think we could say, and this is probably more central, is that, Gebser has archaic, magical, mythical, mental, integral, and civilization only comes in at the mythical stage, right? Yeah. Similarly, Campbell has animal powers, seated earth, celestial lights, man. Civilization only comes in at the celestial light stage.
Celestial light, yeah.
Right. So maybe you could take the baton here and talk about how the interior of a civilized society differs from the interior of a pre-civilized society, what it means to go from magical to mythical, and how that helps explain the exterior things we just talked about, or what it means to go from seated earth to celestial lights, and how that helps explain the exterior features we just talked about.
So now this gets into, I'm glad you brought up Gebser for the interior, because now that gets into the idea of transformations of consciousness that take place that may not have anything to do with the exterior whatsoever, and in fact make it possible. So we move from the magical, which has been in existence forever, since 40,000 BC in Paleolithic Europe, and then on down through the early Neolithic, but I think the later Neolithic, Gebser will say, is mythical, because once we start getting into goddess worshiping agrarian farming populations and we start getting myths there, we just don't have them recorded because we don't have writing from them. But somebody like Hesiod has them recorded, has very ancient myths that go way back further than Homer's Olympian pantheon, which are farmer myths and are much older and probably come in. So in a certain sense, the mythical overlaps with the Neolithic as well as high civilization, whereas Campbell's Celestial Lights does not. For Campbell, it has to involve mathematics and astronomy, because now we have the decimal system of mathematics, the sexagesimal system of mathematics, both of which we still use, in addition to knowledge of the astrological knowledge of the planets and how they move. So he doesn't think that any of that exists during the Neolithic. But Gebser's model is a little more fluid with regard to the mythical consciousness. It tends to embrace both. But there is still left this idea of, how do we explain these sudden mutations of consciousness causally? And I think Gebser would say you're missing the point, because there is no causality. Being a typical German, it just happens. All of a sudden, there's a transformation of consciousness. People have had their mystical identity through the magical consciousness, which tends to unite people through blood. The mysticism of blood, I think, is something that goes way, way back and is connected with kinship groups. It matters in such societies who your clan is, because you share blood ties with them. That is a physical manifestation of a kinship psychologically as well. And then over time, the society has to let go of that. And the Sumerians did, whereas the Akkadians did not. And it's interesting that they're the earliest Semites. And then that goes all the way down to the Hebrews of the Old Testament, who are still maintaining blood ties, kinship through blood, whereas the New Testament liberates us from that. And one of the things about the Sumerians versus the Akkadians, this was a duo ethnic society, is that the Sumerians did have a kind of meritocracy where they put people in office based on their merit, not who they were related to. But then when their sort of Napoleon figure came along, Sargon of Akkad, who was an Akkadian and conquered all of Mesopotamia, he instituted nepotism. He puts blood relatives into all the city-state offices all over the land. So they're still thinking in terms of this tribalism that the Sumerians left behind. And then the Sumerians conquer him and take it back with the third dynasty of Ur. And so there's this fight back and forth between this idea of we are who we are related to by blood, and the credo idea really already with the Sumerians. It doesn't matter as long as you're worshiping Sumerian gods. We don't care who you're related to. So part of it is that blood aspect, the blood tie kinship thing with the magical that's not so much there in the mythical. In the mythical, it does matter what village you belong to, but it may not matter so much who you're descended from. So that's part of it. But there is some sort of interior transformation of consciousness that then makes possible the way of the seeded earth. And then people take an interest in the soil because they realize that they'll have more food if they grow plants and don't just depend on the fickle nature of these wandering gazelle, that are out there, or whatever the animal herd happens to be that the hunters were hunting. The Natufians, who are the first to do this, who are both hunters and agriculturalists, they invent agriculture about between 10 and 12,000 BC on the upper Euphrates. So yeah, it's difficult to explain the nature of the mutation, but maybe Gebser's right. And there is just a certain ripeness in the psyche, the human psyche as a whole, as though it were a single organism, because that would be analogous to, let's say, your consciousness changes once you grow out of childhood into adolescence. Now there's a totally different consciousness there that's governing you with new hormones and the sex drive and a more differentiated way of using your brain to solve problems. So there is a morphology to the individual consciousness. And there may also be a morphology to the species consciousness as well, a certain point where the childhood of man can be left behind, and then there's a maturity. So that would be how I would try to explain that.
So staying on this for a second, right now we're trying to get in the minds of civilized societies and the minds of pre-civilized societies and pinpoint the really key differences to the extent that we can. So if you had to summarize in the clearest way possible, or maybe like the most vivid way possible, what it means to have a mythical consciousness rather than a magical consciousness, and to follow the way of the celestial lights rather than the way of the seeded earth, whether it's ordinary people or elites, concretely, vividly.
Right.
I know it's kind of a hard question.
It's similar to the way James Fraser lays out a similar model, which moves from magic to religion to science. And by religion, he means the mythical consciousness structure as opposed to the tribal magical, where he says that the tribal magical can do everything itself. And not only that, but Campbell points out that the individual in such a society is generally self-sufficient because everyone in the society knows how to do everything. There really isn't specialization in those societies. The hunters hunt, of course, and women do their tasks. So there is that differentiation. But otherwise, the individuals are pretty self-sufficient. Leaving perhaps the religious powers up to the shaman. But otherwise, during the Neolithic, though, all these trades come in. The pottery maker, the guy who handles wood for us, the priest, all these crafts come in, they bring specialists, and it fragments the society so that the individuals start becoming dependent on each other because no one person now can know all the knowledge of the tribe. Or whatever, the village rather, all the knowledge of the village in the mythical consciousness structure. So there's a mutual interdependence, almost like cells in a body. They have to depend on each other now as cells in a larger organism. And it's much more like a living organism than it is in the magical consciousness structure. So there is that nature to it that then gives rise to the priest now has to intercede for us. And we have to go, if we want to send prayers to the gods, we have to bring him offerings to the temple so that he can then send up prayers to Enki or Inanna or whoever the god happens to be on our behalf. Whereas before, the shaman would go out on a vision quest, have his own experiences, or her, plenty of them in the Paleolithic were female, and come back and then handle that for the tribe. But the nature of what that shaman's icons are totally individualistic and unique, because you don't know what animal has attacked him. You don't know what his totem is. It's totally individual and depends on him and him alone. Whereas the priest is always the same. He or she always inherits the same body of dogma and rituals that are state codified and official. So there is that aspect to it. There's an individualistic aspect in the small scale societies, and each individual relying on themselves, not as much on the group as with when you start getting larger and larger groups. All are interdependent and all start forming an organism.
In the past, when you've explicated the difference between magical and mythical for Gebser, you talk about how in the magical consciousness structure, there's a point-like unity, whereas there are 2 points in the mythical. I mean, that was helpful for me. Maybe
right,
to restate it.
Differentiation between the point-like unity means that everything is interconnected with everything else. So if I do magical rituals over here, I can expect ripple effects over there. That's how everything is interconnected. So the consciousness is cavern-like, it's enclosed and interconnected. Pars pro toto is the rule. Whereas with high civilization, you get a differentiation, a yin-yang polarism between the sky gods up there and the earth farmer gods down here. There are two different sets of gods now. And so the soul begins to differentiate into a cosmic soul that has an earth mother, let's say, and a sky father. So you get the myth of the separation of the world. That primordial magical consciousness unity now separates and becomes polaristic to an upper and a lower. That is the difference engine that drives the society.
Oh, interesting. Right.
So you're always going to get two stratum. You're always going to get the old farmer gods. But then when you start building vertically, now we've got sky gods to start appealing to and thinking about. There's another world up there that wasn't taken into account by the farmers. I always like throwing a monkey wrench into these models. And when Campbell is talking about the celestial lights is exclusive to high civilization, there's a German scholar a ways back named Michael Rappengluck, who wrote a book called Himmelskarte aus der Eiszeit, if I'm getting that right, the heaven maps of the Ice Age. And so he went back into these Paleolithic caves, and he thinks some of the animals are constellations. And he thinks that in the cave of Lascaux, there's a bull there that he thinks may be Taurus. And there are dots above the bull that may be I think 6 dots of the Pleiades, whereas the 7th is difficult to see. And there's the shaft of the dead man down below that he thinks that there's a bison there, and the eye of the bison, and there's a bird on a stick there as a shaman is in trance. Each one of the eyes represents one of the stars of the summer triangle. And if he's right, that means then that these people were aware of astronomical maps, Himmelskarte, heaven maps. They were aware, and some of these constellations may be unbelievably archaic. So that's worth thinking about, that there may be some form of astronomy, astrology going back. I'm 100% certain that it doesn't involve elaborate mathematics like sexagesimal and decimal systems and complex calculations, because once human consciousness has evolved to be able to handle those calculations and to start thinking in that kind of abstract phase space, then you can start translating that into physical engineering feats that you can't do just by shoving stones around to build a wall, let's say.
But that would suggest that a religious worldview that incorporates the sky and constellations and sky gods is not really what distinguishes. I mean, to the extent that this German scholar is correct, that's not really what distinguishes the interior, the religious interior of civilized from pre-civilized. Instead, it sounds like you're saying it might be more the mathematical abstraction, correct? More than a particular religious...
They can't think yet. Without writing, you can't really get the mind into that engineering phase space that needs writing for equations and abstract thinking and decimals and complex geometry. Simple geometry, of course, they can do, but complex geometry. That's a different matter, and I think it needs writing for that.
me,
Can't
but
be
of
an
course,
accident
sorry, go ahead.
writing comes in 3,500 BC, right at the same time that the Sumerians start building monumental temples. They're not called ziggurats back then. The ziggurats are later, but they are still monumental. They're very large.
Yeah, I'm just realizing right now it's very dumb of me. I've been thinking of the invention of writing and the invention of mathematics as being somehow separate, but they're not at all. As you say, you have to be able to write down equations. I mean, obviously, you can do some spatial.
You can do basic arithmetical things.
Right.
Sure, and some geometrical thinking, because the earliest monumental structures, the vertical and horizontal, are exactly contemporaneous. The Tower of Jericho, the mud brick tower. That isn't huge, but it's high, it's large, 10,000 BC in Jericho, and then up north in eastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, with the first at the top of a hill, significantly, these round circular megalithic structures with these T-shaped pillars embedded in the walls, that were unearthed not that long ago, maybe a decade ago, that presuppose some kind of geometrical thinking. In both cases, without writing, there's no evidence of writing that early. So there is some basic planar geometry, or whatever it might be called, that the mind can enter into in order to build structures like this.
Right. I mean, because geometry is it's so visual, right?
It is.
So again, staying on this issue of the interior, the vertical interior, have you watched Kenneth Clark's Civilization series?
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. I love it too. And, he's thinking out loud about some of these issues. He offers some thoughts that I think relate to vertical interior and actually relate to some of the things we've talked about, because he says one thing that characterizes the internal life of the civilization is confidence and permanence, like both of those things, right? So there's a sense of permanence, a sense of rootedness, which we've already talked about, that we are here and we are going to be here for the foreseeable future. We are not looking to go anywhere else. So a sense of permanence rather than transience. You're stopping, you're sitting, you're intensive, right? So I think what Kenneth Clark says in the Civilization series and in the book that's based on it, it jives nicely with that.
If I may interrupt really quick, remember the first episode when he's talking about the Vikings, he says, the Vikings do not have civilization, but Romanesque Europe most certainly does. And he says the Vikings don't have writing, they don't have mathematics, they don't have higher thought, they don't have monumental structures. They do have art, because every society has art. There isn't one that doesn't. And by the way, I should point out another footnote. There was a hoax that was perpetrated. It's called the Tassade hoax, that was perpetrated in, I think, in Melanesia, if I recall, in the 70s by this guy Elizadeh, who claimed to have found the oldest Stone Age people in the world. And he would go and visit them, and they would view him as a kind of savior figure. They would wander around naked, and they had these little primitive stone tools. But the giveaway, and Campbell even fell for this in his last book, The Historical Atlas. He even fell for it. It was so convincing. But the giveaway should have been that they didn't have art and they had no myths. Ain't no such thing. The people without art and without myths. Ain't no such thing. That should have been the giveaway. So that's a negative counterexample that's glaring. There is no such thing as a human society without art and myth, but there most certainly is without mathematics and monumental architecture and writing.
Yeah, the Vikings are similar to nomads almost, or in some ways.
Yeah, they're just sea nomads. They've taken over what Deleuze and Guattari called the smooth space of the steppes and re-territorialized it to the smooth space of the ocean. Basically, they're ocean nomads. Yeah, I love the Vikings.
Actually, Clark also says that the people in a civilization, at least one that is growing, have confidence rather than self-doubt. And I think what we would say, I think what Spengler would say, I'm guessing what you would say, is that confidence is very characteristic of the spring and the summer of civilization. And then self-doubt is increasingly characteristic of civilizations as they're getting older and verging on death, right? But at least a high level of confidence in the civilization construction phase is part of the collective interior, or at least the interior of the creative minority, we would say.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So one other aspect of the interior that I'd like to talk about a little bit is I wrote down a couple of notes to myself, and let me think of the best way to put this. So I mean, maybe you can just run with this. You can hear what I'm saying and hear what makes sense out of it and kind of run with it. But what I want to talk about here is the fact that, human beings, we are life. We are organisms. Life goes back 3.5 billion years. So we're this, we're at the very end of an extremely long evolutionary process. And we've only existed for a few 100,000 years. Okay, so what was the characteristic, or what were the features of the evolutionary process that led to us? Well, it was a very brutal world, right? It was just organisms just
Nasty,
killing
brutish,
each other.
and short.
Yeah, and
As
not just between humans, but between our pre-human ancestors.
Everything.
I mean,
yeah,
right, and obviously we've been social since even before we were human, but before that we weren't social, and it really was just every man for himself and dog eat dog, and you're going to get killed and eaten unless you can kill and eat more effectively. So that is our history. That is our deep ancestral history. And one thing that happens with civilization is that we sublimate those violent instincts, right? We find ways of discharging that violent energy in ways that are not destabilizing, right? So a great example would be scapegoating and sacrifice, right? Scapegoating and human sacrifice. And then we even found ways of sublimating human sacrifice, like eating a communion wafer is a sublimation of actual human sacrifice, right? Circumcision or animal sacrifice is sort of a sublimation of human sacrifice. Well, and then eating a communion wafer would be like an even higher level, because you're not actually doing violence to an organism or a part of an organism. You're just eating something that is consubstantial with an organism, with a person, Jesus. And a couple of other thoughts just pop into my mind in this context. The notion that politics is sublimated warfare. It's the continuation of warfare by other means, right? It's conflict channeled through institutions and electoral competition, perhaps at the highest level. Freud said that the first person to hurl an insult rather than a rock founded civilization. So I think you can kind of gather like what I'm trying to get at here. But when we're thinking about the collective interior of civilizations, we're finding ways of sublimating violence.
Yes.
Right?
Right. I was going to say, so yeah, that's an excellent way that you set that up there, because I think of civilization as a disruptor of the natural chain of being. It gets in and it disrupts. And I think Heiner Mühlmann, who's another contemporary German theoreticians, the distinctions here are useful between maximal stress, which the society tries to export and keep out of the internal zone, which he calls a zone of cooperation. So as society has to make that crucial distinction, this is the zone of cooperation. The enemies out there represent a maximal stress threat. So if the Persians are at our gate at Marathon, we need all our strong young men to go out, perform maximal stress so that we can maintain this zone of cooperation. And notice that disintegrates as you get to the Romans with the gladiatorial arenas, where they start importing the maximal stress into the zone of cooperation within an arena that keeps everyone carefully safe. But nonetheless, you can tell that those two zones are breaking down, and you can tell that the civilization is headed for maximum entropy. The other distinction that's useful is Giorgio Agamben's in his book Homo Sacer, where he's talking about how the Romans have this idea of Homo Sacer, which is an individual who has been removed from the sphere. They make a distinction between two different kinds of life. He uses these Greek words, bios and zoe. Bios means that you're inscribed within a certain society in a time and a place that protects you, bios, whereas zoe is bare naked life. You're reduced to the ontological status of an animal. And so this distinction, Homo Sacer, means that this individual can be killed by anyone with impunity because all of his or her rights have been stripped from them. This is the ontological status of a concentration camp victim. They've been put into the mode of bare naked life, Homo Sacer. So they've had that zone of cooperation, Mühlmann's zone of cooperation, withdrawn from them, so that now they're unprotected by the state as a zone of cooperation. So anything can happen to them and no one has to be punished because of it, because there's no inscription, there's no bios to this individual. He's not inscribed within the lattice work of the internal zone of cooperation that is civilization, the whole point of which is to, hurl insults instead of stones, so that we're out of the food chain. That's one of the things civilization, the whole point of it is to get us out of the food chain.
And yet we find ways to sublimate those drives within our civilization again. So gladiator fights are a great example, but even like watching football now, right?
Yeah, because those over millions of years, we have those aggressive tendencies, and they have to be sublimated because you can't get rid of them any more than you can get rid of your sex drive. It's not going to go away no matter what.
Right.
You have to do something about it. So we have, football and sports games, and wars against other people is ideal.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. And just speaking personally, part of me thinks like I was born to die on the battlefield in my early 20s, having already sired 5 kids. I was sort of built to do that. I love warfare. I love conflict. It makes me feel alive.
Yeah.
And people differ in this regard, right? I mean, men in general are more like this than women, but even men differ a lot from each other in terms of how conflict seeking and conflict accepting they are versus conflict averse. And I'm very not conflict averse. I like it.
Either.
Yeah.
I sublimate through watching war films, which is one of my favorite types of movies to watch.
Yeah.
There's something very satisfying about it. And the more violent, the better. Saving Private Ryan is up, it's like, wow, it's like, I love that film. It's exhilarating. Whereas my brother, for instance, is the opposite. He's conflict averse. He doesn't like war films. He won't go anywhere near them. So it's interesting. You're right about the conflict averse versus conflict seeking.
I don't know if you're familiar with the big 5 personality traits, which are very empirically valid.
Heard them. You might remind me.
OCEAN is a good acronym to remember them. The O is for openness versus being more closed, open to new ideas, new experiences versus wanting everything to be kind of similar and familiar. The C is for conscientiousness, so industriousness and orderliness versus the absence of those things. E is extroversion, introversion. A is, and this is the one that's related to conflict aversion. A is for agreeableness. So people who are more agreeable, they're more polite and compassionate. People who are less agreeable are less polite and less compassionate, more conflict accepting or seeking. And it's the archetypal difference between men and women.
I was just going to say, did you see when Jordan Peterson got in trouble for saying that women are more agreeable than men on that show that he was on?
Actually,
was on the hot seat. I could see him sweating. And I was like, I so do not ever want to be you, man. That was intense, but he handled it, well. I would not have. I would have lost it. I would have been kicked off the set.
Like people talk a lot about the Myers-Briggs personality test, but that's not as empirically valid as the big 5 personality traits. What's interesting about the big 5 personality traits is that they were generated atheoretically. They basically asked a ton of people a bunch of questions. They didn't go in with a theory of how personalities differed. They asked a ton of questions and then tried to group the answers in the most sensible way. And they noticed kind of 5 clumpings.
What was the N? I don't think.
Oh yeah, sorry. The N this has now become an old fashioned and much maligned word, but neuroticism, just propensity for negative emotion. So like men and women.
That one might be me. I don't know.
I'm high in trait neuroticism. I'm low in agreeableness.
Me too.
I'm pretty introverted, although not extremely. I'm pretty conscientious, and I'm very open. And interesting, like openness correlates with the political left, whereas conscientiousness correlates with the political right. Agreeableness correlates with the political left, and I'm low in agreeableness, so that kind of pushes me more to the right. So I have like my personality is sort of a jumble of left and right. So temperamentally, I'm sort of pulled between the left and the right sometimes.
So these are all degrees. They're not necessarily.
Of course. Oh, they're all spectrum.
Yeah, because okay.
They're all spectrum completely. Yeah.
Spectrum. Yeah.
Yeah.